The morning Eleanor Voss drove out to see what she had inherited, the sky was the color of old pewter, flat and indifferent above the flat Indiana fields. She had borrowed her neighbor's truck because her own car had a cracked radiator she couldn't afford to fix, and the heater on the borrowed truck worked only on the passenger side. So she drove the 40 minutes from town with one hand numb and the other gripping the wheel like it was the last solid thing left in her life. Which, in a way, it was. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She almost missed the turn. The county road was unmarked, the way it had always been unmarked, because the people who needed to find Voss land already knew where it was. Or at least they used to. Eleanor had not been out here in 11 years. Not since her father's funeral, not since the day her two older brothers had stood on either side of her at the graveside and spoken to her in the careful, reasonable voices men use when they have already decided something and are only waiting for you to accept it. The estate, Garland had said, was complicated. The estate, Franklin had agreed, was going to require professional handling. And Eleanor, who was 39 years old and had driven 6 hours alone because her husband had recently become her ex-husband and she had no one else to call, had nodded and blown her nose into a paper napkin and trusted them completely. That was her first mistake. The Voss property had been in the family for 4 generations. 112 acres of bottomland in the southwest corner of the county, the kind of dark, mineral-rich soil that grows corn so tall it disappears into itself by August. Eleanor's great-grandfather had broken that ground by hand, or near enough to it, and every generation since had added something to the land and taken something from it and handed it on. Her father, Wilhelm Voss, had been a quiet man who expressed love through labor. He'd repaired fences at 4 in the morning. He'd driven combines through the night during harvest rather than lose a single day to weather. He had 3 children and loved all of them, or so Eleanor had believed. What Wilhelm Voss had done, it turned out, was love all of them differently. She learned this in stages. First from the attorney's letter, which arrived on a Tuesday in October, 6 weeks after the funeral, by which point she had already returned to Indianapolis and resumed the exhausting business of rebuilding a life that had come apart at the seams. The letter was 4 pages long and written in the dense, qualifying language of a man who had clearly anticipated a dispute. Eleanor read it twice at her kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold before she finished. Her father had left the farm to Garland and Franklin. The farmhouse, the tillable acres, the equipment, the grain bins, the pond, the timber strip along the north fence, all of it to the brothers, in equal shares. To Eleanor, he had left the smokehouse. She had to read that line 3 times before she was certain she understood it. The smokehouse. She knew the building. Every child who had grown up on Voss land knew the smokehouse. It sat about 200 yards behind the main house, half hidden by a stand of old box elders, a low stone structure with walls that were 18 inches thick and a door so heavy it required 2 hands to open. Her great-grandmother had used it to cure hams and bacon. Her grandmother had stored preserves in it during a summer when the root cellar flooded. By the time Eleanor was a child, it was used for nothing at all. Her father kept the door padlocked. Children were told not to play near it, not because it was dangerous, but because the floor was uneven and it was dark inside, and there was nothing in there worth seeing. Or so they had always been told. The letter from the attorney noted that the smokehouse was situated on a 1/4-acre parcel that had been legally separated from the main farm in Wilhelm Voss's final revision of his estate plan, made 14 months before his death. The building and the land beneath it were hers outright. Her brothers had no claim to them. Her brothers, the letter also noted, had already been informed of these arrangements. Eleanor sat for a long time after she finished reading. Outside, Indianapolis moved through its ordinary afternoon. Cars passed. A dog barked 2 houses down. The tea in her cup had gone completely cold. She thought about what the smokehouse was worth. Stone construction, maybe 800 square feet of interior space, 200 years old, and sitting on a 1/4 acre of land that had no road access except through property her brothers now owned. She tried to calculate this generously. She tried to imagine a scenario in which a landlocked stone outbuilding constituted a meaningful inheritance. She could not. Her brothers, when she called them, were patient and kind in the way people are patient and kind when they believe time is on their side. Garland explained that their father had made these decisions for reasons that probably made sense to Raymond, even if they were hard to understand from the outside. Franklin said that Eleanor had always been more of a city person, hadn't she, and that perhaps their father had recognized she wouldn't have wanted the burden of farming. They offered to purchase her quarter-acre from her. They named a figure. It was not an insult, exactly, but it was not respect either. It was the price of something nobody wanted. Eleanor said she would think about it. Then she stopped returning their calls. For 11 years, she did not think about the smokehouse. Or rather, she thought about it the way you think about a wound that has healed badly, with a dull, habitual awareness that something is not right, that something was taken from you, that the scar tissue tells a story your body is still angry about. She built her life in Indianapolis. She worked as a bookkeeper for a small construction firm for 7 years, then for a dental practice, then for herself, picking up clients one by one until she had something that resembled a small business if you didn't look too closely at the margins. She lived in a rental house in a neighborhood that was on its way up or on its way down, depending on the week. She had a cat named Horace who was old and opinionated. She had friends, real ones, the kind who show up without being asked. She was not unhappy, but she had not sold the smokehouse. Her brothers had asked again, twice, in the years after the funeral. The second time, 6 years ago, the offer was lower than the first, because the building had continued to deteriorate without maintenance, because the box elders were pushing their roots under the stone foundation, because a structure no one uses becomes a liability, not an asset, and they both knew it. Eleanor had thanked them and said she was still thinking. Then Garland had called 8 weeks ago, not with an offer, this time, but with information. The county had begun reassessment proceedings on agricultural land in the district, and the smokehouse parcel, having gone unaddressed for over a decade, was flagged for a delinquency hearing. If Eleanor did not pay the back taxes which had been allowed to accumulate, apparently, through a series of administrative miscommunications, she did not entirely understand the county could move to seize the property. The back taxes were $4,212. Eleanor had $4,311 in her savings account. She paid the taxes. Then she drove to see what she had left. The gravel lane that led from the county road to the farm proper crossed a wooden bridge over a drainage ditch, then curved north toward the main house. Eleanor had no intention of going near the main house. She knew Garland was living there now. Franklin had relocated to Columbus years ago, but still held his share of the farm as an investment, and she was not prepared for that conversation. Not yet. Not until she had stood inside the building her father had chosen to give her and understood, if she could, what he had meant by it. She parked at the edge of the lane, where the box elders began, got out into the cold, pulled her coat tighter. The smokehouse looked worse than she remembered, which was saying something, because she did not remember it fondly. The mortar between the stones had crumbled in places, leaving gaps wide enough to slip a hand into. The box elders had grown taller and closer, their bare winter branches pressing against the north wall, and one of them had dropped a limb on the roof at some point, punching a hole about the size of a dinner plate in the old cedar shingles. The door was still padlocked. The lock was orange with rust. Eleanor stood in front of it for a moment. The wind moved through the box elders. Nothing else moved at all. She had brought bolt cutters. She had not fully admitted to herself, before this moment, why she had brought bolt cutters. She had told herself it was practical, that she might need to get inside to assess the structural damage, to determine repair costs, to understand what she was dealing with. But standing here now, with the cold seeping through her coat and the old stone walls holding the silence the way old stone always does, she understood that she had driven 40 minutes in a borrowed truck with a broken heater because she needed to know what her father had meant. He had separated this parcel from the rest of the estate 14 months before he died. He had done this deliberately, through an attorney, with legal documentation. Raymond Voss had been many things, but careless was not one of them. She cut the lock. The door swung open, reluctantly, on hinges that had not moved in years. The interior was dim, lit only by the hole in the roof and the thin light that filtered through the cracks in the mortar. The smell was cold stone and old wood and something else, something mineral and faintly metallic, that she could not immediately place. The floor was dirt, dark and packed hard. The walls were hung with the rusted ghosts of old hooks, the kind used to hang hams from. Wooden shelves along the east wall held nothing but dust and the collapsed remains of what might once have been a wooden crate. Eleanor stood in the center of the space and turned slowly. Nothing. It was nothing. A cold stone room with a hole in the roof and the smell of 100 years of smoke worked into its walls. She almost left. What stopped her was the floor. She had been looking at the walls, at the shelves, at the rusted hooks, the way you look at a room when you expect to find something hanging or sitting or stored on a surface. But the floor was wrong. Not in a way she could have articulated immediately, but wrong in the way that something trained into a person over years of careful observation announces itself before the rational mind catches up. She had spent 20 years as a bookkeeper. She knew when numbers didn't add up before she could say exactly which column was off. The floor was wrong. She crouched down, pressed her palms against the packed earth, moved to the south wall, then back to the center. The floor was not entirely level, which was not strange for a 200-year-old structure. But there was a section, roughly 6 feet by 8 feet, in the southwestern corner, where the surface had a different quality. Not softer exactly, more settled, as if something beneath it had been compressed by weight rather than simply packed by time. Eleanor sat back on her heels in the cold and the dim light and thought about her father, Raymond Voss, who had repaired fences at 4 a.m, who had kept this building padlocked for as long as any of his children could remember, who had, 14 months before his death, gone to an attorney and legally separated this specific quarter-acre from the rest of the estate that had been in the family for 4 generations, and given it to his youngest child, his only daughter, in a document that his 2 sons had clearly found infuriating or insulting or both, given the offer they had made and the patience they had maintained and the 11 years of not quite letting it go. She thought about her great-grandfather, who had broken this ground by hand. She thought about what a man like that hid, and where he hid it, and why. Then she drove back to town and rented a metal detector. The woman at the equipment rental shop did not ask why Eleanor needed a metal detector. People rented them sometimes to search for lost jewelry or old coins, she explained, and Eleanor nodded and paid with the last money on her credit card and drove back out to the smokehouse with the machine in the back of the borrowed truck. She began in the center of the room and worked outward in a grid pattern, the way she had read online that you were supposed to do, moving slowly, holding the disc flat, and even above the packed earth floor. For the first 15 minutes, nothing. Then, in the southwestern corner, the machine spoke. It did not simply beep. It screamed. The signal was so strong and so immediate that Eleanor flinched back from it, convinced for a moment that she had done something wrong, that the machine was malfunctioning, that the reading was a false positive caused by the iron hooks still hanging from the walls. She stepped back, reset the machine, approached again from a different angle. The machine screamed again. She stood in the corner of the old smokehouse with the metal detector shrieking in her hands, and she looked at the floor, and she thought about her father. She thought, he knew. She thought, he always knew. She thought, and he gave it to me. Eleanor Voss did not own a shovel. She drove back to town and bought one at the hardware store. She also bought a flashlight, a pair of work gloves, a box of contractor bags, and a bottle of water because she did not know how long this was going to take. On the drive back, she called her friend Patricia from the passenger seat of the borrowed truck, because Patricia was the person she called when things were happening that she did not yet understand. Eleanor, Patricia said, when Eleanor had finished explaining. Eleanor, you need to listen to me very carefully. I'm listening, Eleanor said. You need to call someone before you dig. A lawyer, or the County Historical Society, or someone who knows about these things. You don't know what's down there. It could be pipes. It could be an old septic system. It could be the previous owner's collection of tin cans. It could, Eleanor agreed. But she already knew it wasn't. She arrived back at the smokehouse just after 2 in the afternoon, with 3 hours of good daylight left. She opened the door. She set the flashlight in the corner where it threw the most useful light. She pulled on the work gloves. Then she began to dig. The earth in the southwestern corner was harder than she expected. She had imagined, without quite forming the thought clearly, that someone who had buried something would have left the soil loose, easy to move, the way soil is in mystery novels and detective films. But this was 200-year-old earth in a 200-year-old building, packed by generations of weight and weather and time, and it did not yield easily. She dug for 40 minutes before the shovel hit something that was not earth. The sound it made was not a clunk, the way metal sounds when you strike it with metal. It was a different sound. Flatter. Heavier. The sound of something dense and unyielding that had been waiting in the dark for a very long time. Eleanor crouched down, brushed the earth away with her gloved hands. Stone. Not the uncut field stone of the walls, but flat stone, worked flat, fitted together edge to form a surface. A lid. She traced the edges with her fingers and found that the slab was roughly 4 feet by 4 feet, fitted so carefully against the earth around it that the seam was almost invisible. She sat back, looked at the ceiling, let out a breath. Under the floor of an old smokehouse on land her great-grandfather had broken by hand, someone had built a room. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. It took her another hour to clear the earth from around the edges of the stone slab. Her back ached. Her arms ached. The flashlight threw long shadows that shifted when she moved, so that the room seemed to be breathing around her. Outside, the winter afternoon was going gray. She had maybe an hour of daylight left. The slab had an iron ring set into its center, old iron, the kind that had been forged by hand. She gripped the ring and pulled. The stone did not move. She pulled harder, shifted her weight, got her legs into it, pulled with everything she had. For a terrible moment, nothing happened, and she thought she had somehow misread the situation, that this was a foundation stone and not a lid, that the metal detector had found something deep and inaccessible, and she had spent an entire afternoon digging. For nothing. Then something gave. Not the stone itself, but the seal around it, a decade or more of packed earth and settled dust releasing its grip all at once. The slab lifted 3 inches, and cold air rose from beneath it, cold and dry, and carrying that same mineral smell she had noticed when she first opened the door. She got the slab up another 6 inches. Then another. She dragged it sideways on the dirt, inch by inch, until there was a gap wide enough to shine the flashlight into. She shone the flashlight into the gap. For a moment her mind refused to process what she was seeing. The space below the slab was not a hole. It was a room low-ceilinged, maybe 4 feet from floor to ceiling, extending perhaps 12 feet in each direction. The walls were stone, the same careful stone as the smokehouse above, but here the mortar was intact, and the air was dry as bone, sealed by the fitted slab above and the mass of earth around it. Wooden shelves lined the walls, rough-cut but solid, built to last. And on the shelves, stacked with the patient precision of someone who had planned this carefully, were boxes, crates, wrapped bundles, and at the center of the room, covering most of the floor, arranged in rows with the methodical order of a man who trusted nothing he couldn't count and recount, gold. Not gold jewelry, not a handful of coins tucked in a tin, gold bars, dozens of them, stacked in rows on the stone floor like bricks in a low, gleaming wall, their surfaces catching the beam of her flashlight and throwing it back at her in fragments. And beside the gold, canvas bags, the drawstring kind, dozens of those too, their contents heavy and dense, and wrapped in oilcloth, leaning against the far wall, something that glinted where the cloth had shifted coins, thousands of them, loose and stacked, and overflowing from the bags that hadn't been able to hold them all. Eleanor Voss knelt on the floor of a 200-year-old smokehouse in the middle of a cold Indiana afternoon and looked at what her father had given her, and what his father had given him, and what his father before that had carried out of some older and harder place in the world and buried here in the dark, and she could not speak, could not move, could only breathe the cold, dry air rising up from below and understand, slowly, that everything she thought she knew about her family was wrong. Or not wrong, exactly, just incomplete. She called Patricia. "Patricia," she said, when Patricia picked up on the second ring. "Eleanor," Patricia said. "What happened? Are you all right?" "I need you to come out here," Eleanor said. "Bring your husband. Bring a camera. And Patricia, don't tell anyone where you're going." There was a silence on the line. "Eleanor," Patricia said, very carefully. "What did you find?" Eleanor looked down through the gap in the stone at the rows of gold bars, amber in the flashlight beam, patient and silent as the earth that had held them. "I don't know yet," she said. "I need help figuring that out." But she did know. She knew the way you know something before you can explain it, before the numbers have been added up and the columns have been reconciled, and the final figure sits at the bottom of the page in ink. She knew it in her hands and her chest, and the part of her brain that had spent 20 years catching errors that other people missed. Her father had not left her the least valuable piece of the estate. He had left her the only piece that mattered. She sat in the cold and the near dark with her back against the old stone wall and waited for her friend to arrive. And for the first time in 11 years, she allowed herself to feel something she had carefully avoided feeling since the afternoon she had read the attorney's letter and understood what her brothers had been given and what she had not. She allowed herself to feel like her father's daughter. Outside, the winter light was almost gone. The box elders moved in the wind. Somewhere across the fields, a light was on in the farmhouse where her brother lived, warm and yellow in the early dark. He did not know she was here. He did not know what she had found. He did not know that the settlement his father had made, which had looked like favoritism and probably felt like insult and had cost Eleanor 11 years of distance and quiet grief, was not what any of them had thought it was. Not even close. Patricia arrived 40 minutes later, headlights swinging through the box elders. Her husband Thomas out of the passenger side before the car had fully stopped. Patricia was a woman who moved toward trouble the same way she moved through doorways without hesitation, without breaking stride. She took one look at Eleanor's face and said, "Show me." Eleanor showed her. Thomas had brought a proper flashlight, the kind with a broad beam that filled a space rather than cutting through it like a knife. He stood at the edge of the opening Eleanor had cleared and shone the light down into the chamber below. And for a long moment neither he nor Patricia said anything at all. Then Patricia said, slowly, "Eleanor." "I know," Eleanor said. "Eleanor, that's I know. How much is that?" "I don't know yet." "A lot. A very great deal." Thomas, who had a background in construction and a practical turn of mind, was already examining the edges of the stone slab, the quality of the construction below, the way the walls had been built. "Someone put real work into this," he said. "This isn't a hole in the ground. This is engineered, climate-controlled. Almost the stone mass and the insulation of the earth above it would have kept the temperature and humidity stable. Whoever built this knew what they were doing." "My great-grandfather," Eleanor said. "I think. Maybe his father before him. I'm not sure." Thomas looked at her. "Your family's been in this county for how long?" "4 generations," Eleanor said. 140 years. Thomas looked back down at the gold. "People didn't trust banks," Eleanor said, the explanation forming as she spoke it, the pieces assembling themselves from the fragments of stories she had been told as a child and half forgotten as an adult. "My great-grandfather came from Germany. His family, I was told they had been burned once in a bank failure. They didn't trust paper money. They accumulated whatever they could in forms that couldn't be taken. He passed it down, and whoever came after him added to it, and it stayed here, under the smokehouse, under the lock and the dark, under 4 generations of Voss land, under the building her father had given her." She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and held it there. Patricia put an arm around her shoulders. "Hey," she said. "Hey, breathe." "He knew," Eleanor said. "When he made his will. He knew what was here. Of course he knew. He could have left it to all 3 of us. He could have left it to the boys. He left it to me." Patricia did not say anything. She was not the kind of person who rushed to fill silences that needed to sit. "He left it to me," Eleanor said again, more quietly. "After everything." After everything was a phrase that contained 11 years. It contained the distance and the quiet grief and the borrowed truck and the cracked radiator and the back taxes and the bolt cutters and 40 minutes of digging in cold earth. It contained the attorney's letter and her brother's patient, reasonable voices and the figure they had named that was not respect and not quite insult. It contained every moment she had spent wondering whether her father had seen her the way she feared he had, as the city one, the one who left, the one who was more of a woman than a farmer and therefore somehow less. It contained the knowledge that she had been wrong about all of that. Thomas straightened up from examining the chamber. "We need to call someone," he said. "This is beyond the 3 of us. You need appraisers. You need security. You need a lawyer who knows about estate law and another one who knows about asset discovery, and probably a third one I'm not thinking of." "I know," Eleanor said. "But not tonight," Patricia said, reading something in Eleanor's face. "Tonight we stay here, and we don't say anything to anyone, and we figure out what we have. Tomorrow we start making calls." Eleanor nodded. She looked down at the gold in the flashlight beam, patient and silent and waiting, the way it had been waiting for longer than any of them had been alive. "Tomorrow," she said. She stayed at the smokehouse that night, in the borrowed truck with the heater that only worked on the passenger side, while Thomas and Patricia kept watching shifts. She did not sleep. She sat and she thought about her father, about the will, about the 14 months between the revision and the death, about what it meant that he had made those changes when he did. Had he been ill already? Had he known what was coming and decided, in the time he had left, to make certain that what he had protected for so long went to the right person? Or had there been some other reason, some understanding between him and his children that Eleanor had not been privy to, some knowledge of her brothers that she lacked? She did not know. She might never know. Raymond Voss had been a man who expressed love through labor, not words, and he was not here to explain himself. But he had done this thing. He had done it deliberately, carefully, through legal channels, in a document that could not be challenged, and he had given her the building and the land and whatever was beneath it, and whatever he had meant by it. She was going to have to decide for herself what it meant. By 3 in the morning, she had decided. It meant she was her father's daughter. It meant she had always been her father's daughter. It meant the $4,212 she had paid in back taxes was the best money she had ever spent in her life. She almost laughed. In the dark of the borrowed truck, with the winter fields spreading out in every direction and the old stone walls of the smokehouse holding their silence 20 feet away, Eleanor Voss almost laughed for the first time in 11 years. She held it together, but just barely. Morning came gray and cold, the same as the day before, the same as most mornings in Indiana in late November. Patricia brought coffee from a gas station 20 minutes away, 2 cups, extra cream, the way Eleanor had always taken it. They sat in the truck and drank it without speaking much, watching the light come up over the flat fields. Then Eleanor took out her phone and began making calls. The first call was to an attorney in Indianapolis, a woman named Diane Cho who had represented Eleanor during her divorce and who Eleanor trusted because Diane Cho was the kind of lawyer who told you things you didn't want to hear in a tone that made you feel respected rather than diminished. Diane listened without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't touch anything else. Don't move anything. Don't let anyone on the property who isn't Thomas or Patricia. And Eleanor, don't call your brothers." Eleanor said she hadn't planned to. "Good," Diane said. "Give me 6 hours." The second call Eleanor made was to a number she found after 20 minutes of searching online, a firm in Chicago that specialized in asset appraisal for estate and insurance purposes, that had experience with, as their website put it, unusual or historically significant holdings. She explained the situation in general terms, without specifics, and asked whether they could send someone on short notice. The man on the phone asked if she meant the same week or the same day. "The same day," Eleanor said. The man on the phone said he would need a few details before he could commit to that. Eleanor told him she had found, in a sealed underground chamber on private property she owned outright, what appeared to be a significant quantity of gold bullion, gold coinage, and possibly other precious metals, and that she needed a professional assessment before she took any further steps. There was a brief silence. The man on the phone said someone would be there by 2 o'clock. The appraiser arrived at 1:47, in a gray sedan that looked like it belonged to someone who drove to appraisal jobs rather than auctions. His name was Martin Bryce. He was in his 60s, slight, with the careful hands of a man who had spent his life handling things other people were afraid to touch. He carried 2 cases of equipment. He shook Eleanor's hand, looked at the smokehouse, looked at the box elders, looked at the hole in the roof, and said nothing at all until he had gone inside and looked down into the chamber below. Then he said, quietly, "I'm going to need to photograph everything before we move a single item." Eleanor said that was fine. He photographed for 3 hours. He took samples. He used instruments Eleanor didn't recognize to test surfaces and record readings. He worked with the thorough, unhurried focus of someone who had learned not to rush the things that mattered. Eleanor and Patricia sat outside on a fallen log and drank gas station coffee and watched the winter light move across the fields. At 4:45, Martin Bryce came out of the smokehouse. He stood in front of Eleanor and Thomas and Patricia and said, "I want to be precise with you, because precision matters in situations like this, and people often remember numbers wrong when they're in shock." Eleanor said she understood. He said, "Based on today's spot price and the weight and purity of the bullion I've examined, the gold bars alone represent approximately $187 million. The coinage is harder to value without full cataloging. Some of those pieces are historical and carry numismatic value well above their weight in gold, but a conservative preliminary estimate would put the coinage at somewhere between 70 and 90 million. There are also several containers I haven't fully opened that appear to contain additional metal, possibly silver, possibly platinum. I can't give you a number on those tonight. Eleanor heard the numbers. She held them in her mind the way you hold a large object carefully, with both hands, not entirely sure you can carry the weight of it. She said, "So the total," he said, "preliminary, subject to full assessment, and conservative 320 million, roughly, give or take." Thomas sat down on the fallen log very suddenly, as if his legs had decided the conversation was over. Patricia put her hand over her mouth. Eleanor looked at the smokehouse, at the old stone walls with the crumbled mortar and the box elders pressing against the north side, and the hole in the roof that let in a thin line of November sky. Her brothers had gotten the farm, the house, the equipment, the grain bins, the timber strip along the north fence, the pond, 112 acres of the best bottomland in the county. She had gotten the smokehouse. $322 million, she thought, hidden under a building nobody wanted, on a quarter-acre of land nobody needed, left to the daughter everyone had assumed would take the least because she always had. Raymond Voss, her father, a quiet man who expressed love through labor, who had padlocked that door for as long as she could remember, who had gone to an attorney 14 months before he died and changed his estate plan and made absolutely sure that what 4 generations of his family had built and hidden and protected ended up where he believed it belonged. She thought about Garland's patient, reasonable voice. She thought about the figure they had named. She thought, "Oh, Dad." She thought, "I understand now." She thought, "I understand everything." Martin Bryce was watching her with the practiced, neutral expression of a man who had delivered large numbers to people before and understood that the reaction was never what anyone expected. He had seen people cry. He had seen people laugh. He had seen a woman sit down on the floor of a barn in rural Kentucky and not get up for 20 minutes. He stood now with his clipboard in his careful hands and waited for Eleanor to come back to herself. She came back in stages. First, she became aware of the cold again, the particular bite of November air on her face and the backs of her hands. Then she became aware of Thomas, still sitting on the fallen log with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the ground, the expression of a man recalibrating his entire understanding of the afternoon. Then she became aware of Patricia, who had taken her hand at some point without Eleanor noticing and was holding it the way you hold something fragile firmly enough to keep it safe, gently enough not to break it. She said, to no one in particular, "We need to secure this." Thomas looked up. He nodded. "Yeah," he said. "We do." "Mr. Bryce," Eleanor said. "What happens next? Procedurally, what am I supposed to do?" Martin Bryce had done this before. He spoke clearly and without condescension, the way a doctor speaks when they have delivered news, and now the patient needs steps, needs a path forward, needs the abstraction of large facts to resolve into small and manageable actions. He told her she needed to report the discovery to the county assessor's office, since the value of the property had materially changed. He told her she needed an estate attorney who could advise her on the tax implications of inherited assets, which were different from the tax implications of found assets, and the legal status of her discovery would need to be established carefully given that the chamber appeared to have been constructed generations ago by family members who were no longer living. He told her she needed physical security for the site immediately, professional security, not a padlock. He told her the full appraisal would take weeks, possibly longer, given the volume of material and the need to catalog the coinage individually. He told her, gently, that she should not speak to her brothers about this until she had spoken to a lawyer. "I wasn't planning to," Eleanor said. He nodded. "Good," he said. And then, with the slight softening of expression that meant he was departing from his professional role for just a moment, "For what it's worth, in 30 years of this work, I have never seen a discovery like this. Your family kept this secret for over 100 years. That's extraordinary." Eleanor looked at the smokehouse, at the old stone and the rusted hooks and the hole in the roof. "They were private people," she said. Bryce smiled. "Evidently." He packed his equipment and left before 5, promising a preliminary written report within 48 hours. Thomas stayed to help Eleanor replace the stone slab over the chamber and cover the disturbed earth as best they could, packing the excavated soil back into the edges to discourage casual notice. It was imperfect and both of them knew it, but it was what they had. Patricia sat in the truck and made calls. She found a private security firm in Indianapolis that could have someone on site by 9 that evening. 2 people, round the clock, in a vehicle that would sit at the mouth of the lane where it met the county road. She gave Eleanor's name and Eleanor's number and said yes to everything because this was not a situation in which you negotiated rates. By 7 o'clock, Eleanor was alone in the smokehouse. Thomas and Patricia had gone to find food and bring it back. The security firm's vehicle was at the end of the lane. The cold had deepened with the darkness, and Eleanor had borrowed a lantern from Thomas's car and set it in the center of the dirt floor, where it threw a warm circle of light against the stone walls. She sat inside that circle and thought. She thought about the years. Not in a self-pitying way. She had not been a self-pitying person. Not really. Not even during the worst of it. Not even when the marriage ended or when the business was slow or when the letter from the attorney had arrived and she had understood what it meant. Self-pity was a luxury she had never quite been able to afford. But she thought about the years honestly, the way a bookkeeper thinks about a ledger she has been handed after a long time away, noting what had been lost, noting what had been accumulated, trying to understand where the balance stood. 11 years of distance from the family farm. 11 years of building something small and hers and fragile. The rental house. The cat named Horace. The friends who showed up without being asked. The business that existed if you didn't look too closely at the margins. The $4,212 that had been almost everything she had. She had paid it without hesitation. That was interesting to her now. She had known, on some level she could not have articulated at the time, that she was not paying to preserve a liability. She had known she was paying to keep something she was meant to have. She had not known what, precisely. But she had known. Or maybe she had just been stubborn. It was hard to tell the difference, sometimes, between instinct and stubbornness. Her father had had both in abundance. He had passed them on, apparently, though not in equal measure to all 3 of his children. She thought about Garland and Franklin. This was harder. She had not hated her brothers. That would have been simpler, in some ways, cleaner. What she felt instead was a complicated thing that had no single name, a mixture of hurt and resignation, and the particular weariness that comes from loving people who have disappointed you so thoroughly that you no longer expect anything from them, and are therefore no longer surprised, but are also never quite finished grieving what they might have been. They had not been cruel, exactly. They had not stolen. They had accepted what their father gave them and offered her a price for what he had given her and been patient about it for 11 years, which was, she supposed, something. They had not threatened her or pressured her into selling. They had simply assumed, in the way that people assume things they have always believed, that they knew how the story went. The brothers got the farm. The daughter got what was left over. That was the shape of things in families like theirs, or so they had believed, and they had built their understanding of fair and unfair around that shape so thoroughly that they could no longer see it as a shape at all. They saw it as reality. She wondered what they would say when they found out. She discovered, sitting in the lantern light in the cold smokehouse with $322 million of family legacy under the floor at her feet, that she did not feel triumphant about that question. She had expected to feel triumphant, if this moment ever came. She had occasionally, in the worst moments of the last 11 years, fantasized about exactly this kind of reversal, the moment when it became clear, finally and irrefutably, that she had been right to hold on, that she had not been foolish or sentimental or too proud to take a reasonable offer. But triumph required an opponent, and she did not, sitting here now, quite feel that her brothers were her opponents. They were men who had understood the world a certain way and had acted accordingly, and they were going to have to revise their understanding, and that revision was going to be uncomfortable for them. That was not triumph. That was just the slow, impersonal turning of things. What she felt, sitting in the cold and the lantern light, was something quieter and more complicated. She felt, for the first time in a very long time, entirely correct. Not vindicated. Not triumphant. Not proven right in the face of people who had doubted her. Just correct. Aligned. The way a figure aligns in a ledger when the columns finally balance and the number at the bottom is exactly what it should be. Her father had known her. He had known her well enough to understand. without explaining himself what she would do with this. He had known she would pay the taxes. He had known she would not sell. He had known she would come out here eventually, with whatever tools she needed, and look at the floor, and look again, and not stop looking until she found what was there to be found. He had known she was a person who caught errors that other people missed. The lantern flickered. Outside, the wind moved through the box elders. Eleanor sat with her back against the cold stone wall and held all of it, the numbers, the years, the distance, the grief, the coming morning when she would have to begin the enormous and probably exhausting work of turning this discovery into something she could actually live in and let herself be still for a little while. Patricia came back at 8 with sandwiches from a gas station 30 minutes away and 2 more coffees and a look that said she had been crying in the car and was not going to mention it. They ate in the smokehouse, sitting on the floor with the lantern between them, their breath fogging in the cold air. After a while, Patricia said, "What are you going to do?" Eleanor thought about it. What she would do with $322 million was not something she could fully conceive of yet. The number was too large to hold clearly. It was like trying to picture the distance to a star. You could say the words, you could work with the math, but the reality of the thing stayed stubbornly abstract, refusing to resolve into anything you could see with ordinary eyes. But she knew some of it. Some of it was already clear. The rental house, she would leave. She had never liked it. She would find something with a porch, probably, somewhere she could sit outside in the mornings and watch whatever there was to watch. Not a mansion. She was not a person who wanted a mansion, but something solid, something hers. The business, she would keep. She was good at it and she liked it, and the people she worked for needed her, and money did not change the satisfaction of a balanced ledger or the specific pleasure of catching the error everyone else had missed. She might eventually do it differently, hire someone to help, take fewer clients, be selective about who she worked with, but she would keep it. Horace the cat would require no adjustments. The brothers that she did not know yet. That was a conversation that needed a lawyer present and probably several months of distance and the slow rearrangement of all their understandings of each other. She was not going to rush it. She was not going to make any decisions about her brothers while she was sitting on the floor of the smokehouse at 8 o'clock at night with a gas station sandwich and the numbers still ringing in her ears. But she knew what she was not going to do. She was not going to be quiet about this. She was not going to manage her brother's feelings at the expense of her own clarity. She was not going to accept, from anyone, the narrative that this was luck, or a misunderstanding, or a windfall that had nothing to do with her. This was hers. It had always been hers. It was hers because her father had seen her clearly enough, loved her carefully enough, to make it so. She was going to let that be true. She said, "I'm going to take care of myself. For once." Patricia looked at her. And then, Eleanor said, "I'm going to figure out how to do something good with it. The rest of it. The part that's more than any one person needs." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your dad would like that." Eleanor nodded. She thought he would. The sandwiches were bad. The coffee was worse. The cold was relentless, and the lantern was growing dim, and the security firm's car at the end of the lane was the only thing standing between this discovery and the rest of the world, which did not yet know it existed. Eleanor sat in the smokehouse her great-grandfather had built, on the land her great-grandfather had broken, above the vault her great-grandfather had hidden, and she thought about 4 generations of people who had understood, in a way that she was only now beginning to fully grasp, that the most valuable things are the ones you protect in the dark. Not forever, just until the right person is ready to bring them into the light. She was ready. The night after the discovery, Eleanor Voss did not sleep. She sat in the borrowed truck with both hands wrapped around a gas station coffee that had gone cold, watching the security firm's car at the end of the lane, watching the light in the farmhouse across the fields where her brother slept, without knowing what the morning was going to bring. The stars were very clear, the way they are in flat country far from city light, and she had spent enough time in Indianapolis to have forgotten how many there were. She counted them, absently, the way she counted figures in her work, not to arrive at a final number, but to give her hands and eyes something to do while the deeper part of her mind worked. She had found $322 million under the floor of a building nobody wanted. She held the number carefully. It was too large to feel real, which was, she supposed, what very large numbers always were: theoretical, abstract, requiring the translation of ordinary life to become concrete. $322 million was, The back taxes paid 4,000 times over. It was every car she had ever owned, every apartment she had ever rented, every piece of furniture, every grocery bill, every medical expense, every check she had written in her adult life, multiplied by a factor she could not quite make herself calculate. It was the distance between where she had been standing yesterday morning and where she was standing now, which was not a distance that had a name. She sat in the dark and held the number and let the night move around her. Somewhere to the east, a coyote called. Something in the field moved, something small and fast, and the box elders shifted in the wind. The farmhouse light across the field went out at 11:17, which meant Garland had gone to bed, which meant he did not yet know what the security firm's car at the end of his lane signified. He would figure it out in the morning. He was not a stupid man. She thought about what he would do when he figured it out. She had known Garland for her entire life, or believed she had, which is not quite the same thing. She knew his patterns, his rhythms, the way he moved through situations that displeased him, the careful patience, the formal language, the preference for processes and structures that gave him the advantage of having observed longer than anyone else in the room. He had always been like that, even as children. The oldest child's instinct, perhaps, the one who had arrived first and understood earliest that the world could be navigated rather than simply experienced. She thought about the offer he had made 11 years ago, and the offer 6 years after that, lower than the first. The price going down as the building's condition deteriorated, as the rational case for keeping it weakened. She thought about how certain he must have been, in those moments, that she would eventually accept. That she was simply a woman with a cracked radiator and a small business, and a rental house, and no particular reason to hold on to a stone outbuilding in a county she no longer lived in. She thought about how wrong he had been. Not because she had been smarter than him. She had not known what was under the floor any more than he had. But she had been stubborn, which was different from smart, and sometimes more useful. She had held on not because she understood what she was holding, but because it was hers, and she was not a person who let go of what was hers without a reason she could respect. Her father had understood that about her. In the morning, she would begin to understand what it meant. Tonight, she simply let it be true. Diane Cho arrived the next morning at 7:45 in a car that was too clean for a gravel lane in November, wearing a coat that suggested she had driven straight from her house rather than from her office, which meant she had not gone home the night before, which meant she had spent the night working. Eleanor knew this about Diane the way she knew things about people she had observed carefully over years, not from anything Diane said, but from the small details that accumulated into a picture if you were paying attention. The coat. The coffee she was holding that was not from a gas station. The particular quality of alertness in her expression, the kind that comes not from sleep, but from focus sustained past the point of ordinary endurance. Diane looked at the smokehouse. She looked at the security firm's car, still parked at the end of the lane. She looked at Eleanor, who had slept 2 hours in the borrowed truck and whose hair showed it. She said, "Tell me everything in the exact order it happened." Eleanor told her. It took 20 minutes, standing in the cold outside the smokehouse door, because Eleanor had learned long ago that the way you told a lawyer something mattered as much as what you told them, and she wanted Diane to have the sequence correct before she had an opinion about any of it. When Eleanor finished, Diane was quiet for a moment. Not uncertain. Diane Cho was never uncertain, or at least never visibly so, but assembling. Then she said, "The legal situation is manageable, but not simple. The gold was buried on land your father owned outright before the estate was divided. The estate plan legally transferred the smokehouse parcel to you, which means the land and everything on or under it is yours by inheritance. The complication is that the original chamber appears to have been constructed well before your father's ownership, which raises questions about whether the contents constitute a found object under property law or an inherited asset. Those are taxed differently." "How differently?" Eleanor said. "Significantly," Diane said. "We'll want an estate attorney who specializes in this kind of discovery. There's a category of law called treasure trove doctrine that applies in some states. Indiana has specific statutes. We need someone who knows them." "I thought you were an estate attorney," Eleanor said. "I'm your estate attorney," Diane said. "I'm going to find you the right specialist and coordinate with them. That's different from being out of my depth." "I'm not out of my depth. I'm being precise." Eleanor almost smiled. That was why she trusted Diane. The first complication arrived at 9:15, in the form of Garland Voss's truck pulling slowly down the lane from the main house. Eleanor had known this was coming. The security firm's vehicle was visible from the farmhouse, and Garland was not. A man who ignored unfamiliar cars on his property. Or rather, on the property that was almost entirely his. He parked behind the borrowed truck and got out slowly, the way men his age got out of trucks in cold weather, taking his time, making no sudden movements. He was 63, heavier than he had been at their father's funeral, with the same weathered patience in his face that Eleanor remembered from childhood, the same quality of having calculated everything before he said a word. He looked at the security vehicle. He looked at Diane's car. He looked at Eleanor and at Diane standing beside her, and his expression shifted, slightly, into something that was not quite suspicion but was adjacent to it. "Eleanor," he said. "Garland," she said. He looked at the smokehouse, at the bolt cutters still lying in the dirt near the door, because she had not thought to move them, at the disturbed earth visible through the open door. He said, "What's going on out here?" Diane stepped forward before Eleanor could speak. She extended her card with 2 fingers, a gesture so practiced it seemed like punctuation. "Diane Cho," she said. "I'm Ms. Voss's attorney." "And you are?" Garland looked at the card, looked at Eleanor. "I'm her brother," he said. "I own the land on 3 sides of this building." "You own the land on 3 sides of this building," Diane agreed. "Your sister owns this building and the quarter-acre it sits on, which is what we're here to discuss. If you have questions about that arrangement, you're welcome to have your own attorney contact my office." Garland was not a man who was easily unsettled. Eleanor had watched people try to unsettle him for 30 years and had rarely seen it work. But something in Diane's precise, unhurried manner produced a stillness in him that was not his usual confidence. It was the stillness of a man who had walked into a room expecting one conversation and found a different one in progress. He said, to Eleanor, not to Diane, "You found something." It was not a question. Eleanor looked at her brother, at the face she had known her whole life, the face of a man she had loved and been hurt by and missed, in complicated and unequal proportions, for 11 years. She said, "You should call your attorney, Garland." He stood there for another moment. Then he got back in his truck and drove back to the farmhouse without another word. Diane watched him go. Then she said, "He knew." "What do you mean?" "He knew something was down here, or he suspected it. That's why he's been trying to buy you out for 11 years. Eleanor considered this. She had wondered, in the night, whether her brothers had known. It was impossible to be certain. The smokehouse had been padlocked their entire lives. Their father had never spoken about it, as far as she knew. But Raymond Voss had been a man with 3 children, and he had revised his estate plan, and if he had ever mentioned the chamber to anyone, even obliquely, even in a moment of illness or sentiment, it would have been easier to name. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe he suspected. Maybe he just knew the building had value he didn't understand. Or maybe," Diane said, "your father told him enough to make him want it without telling him enough to know exactly what he was wanting." That sounded like Raymond Voss, a man who kept his own counsel, who understood that partial information was its own kind of power. The full appraisal team arrived that afternoon. Martin Bryce returned with 2 colleagues, a woman named Carolyn who specialized in historical coinage, and a younger man whose name Eleanor did not catch who handled precious metals assessment. They brought equipment she had not seen the day before: a portable XRF analyzer, a scale calibrated to fractions of a gram, archival photography gear, a catalog system run off a laptop that fed directly to a secure server in Chicago. They worked for 9 hours. Eleanor did not watch the whole of it. She could not. There is a particular variety of exhaustion that comes not from physical exertion, but from sustained emotional intensity, the kind that settles into the body like a low fever and makes ordinary movement feel effortful. She walked the perimeter of the property. She sat on the fallen log. She ate the food Patricia brought at noon without tasting it. She called Horace's vet and asked if he could board the cat for a few extra days, explaining that she had a family situation, which was the most accurate thing she had said in weeks. At 6 in the evening, Carolyn, the coin specialist, came out of the smokehouse and sat on the fallen log beside Eleanor without preamble. "I want to show you something," she said. She had a photograph on her tablet, a close-up of a coin she had removed from one of the canvas bags and photographed before returning it. The coin was gold, thick, with the worn edges of something very old. The markings on its face were not American. "Do you know what this is?" Carolyn asked. Eleanor looked at it. No, this is a German gold mark. Late 19th century, but pre-imperial. The type would have been in circulation in the decades before German unification in 1871. She zoomed in on the markings. This particular variation was minted in the Kingdom of Bavaria. Eleanor's great-grandfather had come from Germany. She had known this in the vague, ancestral way you know things about people who died before you were born. She had not known, specifically, from where. You said Bavaria. Carolyn nodded. There are several hundred coins of this type in the collection. There are also coins from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, from Prussia, and from several smaller German states that ceased to exist after unification. All of them are consistent with the kind of wealth a family with means might have carried out of. Europe in the period between 1860 and 1890, which is roughly when immigration to the American Midwest peaked for families of that background. Eleanor looked at the photograph for a long moment. He didn't trust banks, she said. I was told that when I was a child. His family had been burned in a bank failure. Carolyn nodded slowly. That's consistent with the history. There were significant banking crises in the German states in the 1840s and 1850s. Families who had savings wiped out in those events often converted to hard assets and maintained that distrust for generations. So he brought it with him. It appears so. And then, Carolyn said carefully, the people who came after him added to it. Eleanor stared at the field beyond the box elders. At the flat, dark Indiana earth that her great-grandfather had broken by hand after crossing an ocean with whatever he could carry that banks could not touch. She said, how much of what's down there is what he brought over? Impossible to say precisely, Carolyn said. But the oldest coins date to the 1840s. The gold bars are mixed, some are consistent with late 19th century production, others are more recent. The collection was added to over time. Someone in every generation was buying gold, converting savings to metal and adding it to the store. For generations, Eleanor said. For generations, Carolyn agreed. Your family has been doing this for a very long time. This isn't a single act of hiding. This is a practice, a tradition, something passed down. Eleanor thought about her father, about the way he had checked the lock on the smokehouse door every time he passed it, the small habitual gesture she had noticed as a child without understanding it. The way he had kept the building in reasonable repair even as he let the surrounding land go to weeds. The way he had, 14 months before he died, gone to an attorney and made certain. He knew exactly what he was protecting, she said. Yes, Carolyn said. He absolutely did. The final preliminary number, when Martin Bryce presented it to Eleanor and Diane that evening in the lantern light of the smokehouse, was $322 million. It was the same figure he had given her the night before, but arrived at with more precision now, more certainty, the estimate replaced by something closer to fact. The gold bullion, $189 million at current spot price. The coinage, between $88 and $94 million, with the upper range more likely once numismatic premiums were fully calculated. Additional metals, $31 million, mostly silver, some platinum, $322 million. Hidden under a stone slab, under a packed earth floor, under a padlocked smokehouse door in a building everyone in the family had been told held nothing worth seeing. Diane made notes. She had been making notes all day on a yellow legal pad she carried like a talisman. When Bryce finished speaking, she said, "We'll need independent verification before any of this is actionable. 2 additional appraisal firms, minimum. And we need the estate tax question resolved before we do anything that could be construed as exercising ownership." That's going to take time, Bryce said. It is, Diane agreed. Ms. Voss, are you prepared for this to take months before anything is settled legally? Eleanor was sitting on the floor of the smokehouse with her back against the cold stone wall, the same position she had been in the night before, and she felt, looking up at the two of them, Diane with her legal pad and Bryce with his carefully calibrated face, a feeling she recognized from her work. The feeling of having found the error, of knowing where the column was wrong and understanding that the correction was going to take as long as it took, and there was nothing to be gained by rushing it. I've waited 11 years, she said. A few more months won't break me. Diane nodded. Good. Then here's what we do tomorrow. The next 2 weeks moved with the particular speed of things that are simultaneously urgent and slow. Urgent because $322 million in a hole in the ground was a situation that demanded action. Slow because every action required paperwork and verification and the deliberate, methodical progress of legal and financial systems that had not been designed for situations like this and were not going to be hurried simply because one woman's life had been upended in a cold November afternoon in Indiana. Eleanor hired a second attorney, a man in Indianapolis who specialized in estate asset discovery and had handled 3 similar cases in his career, none of them anywhere near this scale. She hired a security firm to maintain the site 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. She commissioned the 2 additional appraisal firms Diane had specified. She met with a tax consultant, and then with a second tax consultant, and then with a third one, because the first 2 disagreed on a point of Indiana inheritance law, and she needed a tiebreaker. She did not go back to Indianapolis. She stayed in a motel in the nearest town large enough to have one, a place with thin walls and a vending machine that sold energy drinks and crackers, and she drove out to the Smokehouse every morning and stood outside it for a few minutes before the day's business began. It was a habit she developed without deciding to develop it. Just standing there, looking at the old stone, the box elders, the hole in the roof that she had already arranged to have repaired. She had begun to think of the Smokehouse differently, not as the insult she had been given, not as the booby prize, not as the thing that had represented everything she had been denied. She had started to think of it as the thing her father had understood, would survive her brother's impatience, that would outlast the years and the distance and the slow erosion of connection that happens to families when grief is handled badly. He had given her the stone. He had given her the thing that could not be sold cheaply, because anyone who did not know what was inside it would assume it was worth nothing, and anyone who did know what was inside it would understand immediately that it was worth everything. He had given her the thing that required patience to claim. She thought about that a great deal in the motel with the thin walls. Garland called on the 5th day. Not to her directly, she had asked Diane to manage all contact with her brothers, but through his attorney, with a formal request for information about activity on the Smokehouse parcel. The request was politely worded and legally grounded and conveyed, underneath the politeness and the legal grounding, a considerable amount of anxiety. Diane responded with equal politeness and no information whatsoever. Franklin called from Columbus 2 days after that, also through an attorney, also politely, also conveying anxiety through formal language. He requested a family meeting, suggesting that matters of significant mutual interest were better addressed together than through intermediaries. The phrase significant mutual interest was, Diane pointed out to Eleanor, an interesting choice given that Franklin had no legal interest in the Smokehouse parcel whatsoever. Eleanor said she would think about the meeting. She was not ready to see her brothers yet. She understood that she would have to, eventually, that there were conversations that needed to happen and that delaying them indefinitely would accomplish nothing useful. But she was not ready. The discovery was still too new, the numbers still too large to hold clearly, and she knew herself well enough to know that she needed the ground under her feet to be solid before she stood in front of Garland and Franklin and said what needed to be said. The discovery leaked on the 11th day. Eleanor had expected this. You could not keep $322 million secret in a county of 12,000 people indefinitely. Too many people knew: the attorneys, the appraisers, the security firm, the county assessor's office, the tax consultants. Any one of them might have said something to someone, or not said anything and had it noticed anyway, the way things are always noticed in small counties where everything unusual eventually arrives at the surface. The first story appeared in the regional newspaper. It was vague, a reference to a significant estate discovery on agricultural land in the southwest corner of the county, pending legal resolution, details unavailable at press time. By the following morning, it had been picked up by a news wire and distributed to 50 outlets across the state. By evening, it had appeared on 3 national news websites, each version slightly more specific and slightly less accurate than the one before. By the morning after that, there were 2 television news vans parked on the county road near the mouth of the lane. Eleanor handled this with the same equanimity she had brought to everything else, which was not a natural equanimity so much as a practiced one. The equanimity of a person who has learned that visible distress accomplishes nothing, and composure, even performed composure, tends to create space that panic would fill. She did not speak to the television cameras. She did not respond to the emails that began arriving through her business website. She issued a single brief statement through Diane's office confirming that a discovery had been made on private property she owned, that legal proceedings were ongoing, and that she would have more to say when those proceedings were complete. She found the public attention less distressing than she had anticipated, and more distressing in ways she had not anticipated. The less distressing part was the strangers. People she did not know expressing interest, excitement, support, the ordinary human hunger for stories of unexpected reversal. She had no history with these people. Their interest was uncomplicated. The more distressing part was the people she did know. Former colleagues from the dental practice who called to congratulate her. Acquaintances from Indianapolis who had never quite treated her as someone who mattered and were now treating her as someone who mattered enormously. The adjustment so seamless and unself-conscious that they did not appear to notice they were making it. And the neighbors. People from this county who had known her father, who had attended his funeral, who had watched the estate division without comment or had commented only to each other, in the careful private language of communities that do not involve themselves in family matters. These people called the motel and sent notes to Diane's office and stopped Eleanor in the parking lot of the hardware store where she had gone to buy a new padlock for the Smokehouse door. They were kind, most of them. They said things like, "Your father always did have a specific way of seeing things," or, "I always thought there was more to that arrangement than met the eye." One woman, who had been her mother's closest friend and was now in her 80s, took Eleanor's hand in both of hers in the hardware store parking lot and said, without preamble, "He talked about you. Every year at Christmas, he talked about you. He was proud of you, Eleanor. He just wasn't a man who knew how to say it to your face." Eleanor stood in the parking lot in the cold and held the old woman's hands and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would have been adequate. She bought the padlock and drove back to the Smokehouse. Garland's attorney contacted Diane's office on the 14th day with a formal legal challenge. The challenge was not, as Eleanor had half expected, a dispute over her ownership of the Smokehouse parcel that was airtight, documented, legally separated from the rest of the estate in language that a first-year law student could have defended. The challenge was something more creative. It argued that the underground chamber, having been constructed before the legal separation of the parcel, constituted an improvement to the land as it existed at the time of the estate's original creation, and that improvements of significant value made prior to the division of an estate were subject to equitable distribution among all heirs. It was, Diane told Eleanor, a reach. "A significant reach?" Eleanor asked. "A reach in the sense that I would not want to present it to a judge I respected," Diane said. "But it's not frivolous. It's an argument a reasonable attorney could make with a straight face, and depending on the judge and the day, a reasonable judge might take it seriously enough to require a formal response." Eleanor looked at the legal document Diane had printed for her, at the formal language of her brother's claim, the particular vocabulary of men who were trying to take something they were not entitled to while convincing themselves they had a right to it. She thought about 11 years, about the $4,212, about the bolt cutters and the metal detector and 40 minutes of digging in cold earth. She said, "What do we do? We fight it," Diane said, "and we win. But it's going to take time." It took for months. The hearing was held in the county courthouse in March, in a room that smelled of old wood and radiator heat, before a judge named Morrison who had the expression of a man who had seen a great many creative legal arguments in his years on the bench and found most of them more interesting than convincing. He read Garland's attorney's brief without visible reaction. He read Diane's response with the same patience. He heard oral arguments on a Thursday morning in a room that was less than half full because the case had been sealed from press at Eleanor's request, which meant the television vans had no idea what was happening inside. He issued his ruling the following Monday. The underground chamber, he found, had been constructed as part of the original property and had no legal identity separate from the land on which it sat. The Smokehouse parcel, legally separated from the larger estate in the estate plan of Wilhelm Voss, included the land and everything on or under it, in perpetuity. There was no equitable claim by co-heirs to a discovery made on property exclusively owned by another heir. The challenge was dismissed. Garland's attorneys filed a notice of intent to appeal. Diane had expected this. She said so without emotion, as if it were simply the next item on a list. The appeal, she told Eleanor, would take another 3 to 6 months at minimum. and would almost certainly fail, and the cost of failing it would not fall on Eleanor, but on Garland, who was funding the legal effort himself and would need to calculate at some point whether the cost was worth the outcome. That calculation, Diane said, was something Garland would have to make himself. Eleanor thought about her brother, about the patience he had maintained for 11 years while trying to acquire a building he had suspected was worth more than it appeared, about the reasonable voice and the considered offers and the assumption, held so long it had become invisible to him, that he was entitled to understand what he did not own. She almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The appraisal process concluded in April. 3 firms had now assessed the collection independently, and their numbers, within a narrow and professionally acceptable range of variation, agreed with each other. The total value, as of the date of discovery, was $322 million. The tax determination, which had taken longer than anything else and had involved consultants in 3 states and one very expensive conversation with someone at the IRS who specialized in exactly this kind of historical estate asset, concluded that the collection qualified as inherited property under Indiana law, since it had been transmitted through a legally valid estate plan from a decedent to a named heir. The tax rate was considerably lower than it would have been for a found object or a windfall, though it was not trivial. Eleanor paid it. She paid it in one transaction, which required a wire transfer of a size she had never previously imagined performing. And when it cleared, she sat at the desk in her motel room with her hands flat on the table and breathed steadily for 2 full minutes. Then she began to think about what came next. The appeal failed in September. A 3-judge panel in the appellate court declined to overturn Judge Morrison's ruling in language that was, Diane told Eleanor, as close to a mild reprimand as appellate judges usually get. Garland's attorneys sent a final letter through formal channels indicating that their client did not intend to pursue further legal action. The letter was 2 sentences long. It contained no apology and no acknowledgement of anything beyond the strictly legal. Eleanor filed it in the folder she had been keeping on the case. Then she closed the folder and put it on the shelf. She had been living in Indianapolis again for 3 months by the time the appeal failed. She had found a house, not the rental, but a house she owned, a modest Victorian in a neighborhood she liked, with a porch that looked out over a street full of old trees that would be magnificent in the spring. She had paid for it in cash, which had produced an expression on the face of the real estate agent that Eleanor suspected the woman would describe at dinner parties for years. She had repaired the cracked radiator on her own car, though she had also purchased a second car, because she was not a person who needed to maintain a cracked radiator as a point of principle. Horace the cat had been retrieved from the vet and had adjusted to the new house with the serene indifference of a very old cat who had decided that everywhere was equally acceptable as long as the food arrived on schedule. The business was still operating. She had hired an assistant, a young woman named Kezia who was meticulous and quick and had the useful quality of not being particularly impressed by anything, which Eleanor had found was the quality she most needed in the person sitting across from her at work. She had taken fewer clients. She had become more selective. She had begun, tentatively, to think about whether there were other things she wanted to do with her professional life, other kinds of work that required the same skills she had been applying for 20 years, but in contexts that mattered to her in a different way. She did not know yet what those things were. That was all right. She had time. On a Saturday in October, nearly a year after she had first driven out to the Smokehouse in the borrowed truck, Eleanor drove out again. This time in her own car. This time in weather that was, if not warm, at least not hostile, a pale October afternoon with the light coming sideways through the trees the way it does in that season. Everything golden and slightly melancholy, the way fall always is. The Smokehouse had been repaired. She had paid for this herself, hiring a mason who specialized in historic stone structures, and the work had been done carefully and well. The hole in the roof was patched. The crumbling mortar had been repointed. The box elders had been trimmed back from the north wall. The building looked, for the first time in her memory, like something that was being cared for. She stood outside it for a while. Then she unlocked the door, her own lock now, a proper one, and went inside. The chamber had been emptied months ago. The gold had been removed and transferred to secure facilities while the legal and tax proceedings ran their course, and it now existed in the form it would maintain going forward. Investment accounts, trusts, real estate, the instruments of organized wealth that Diane and a team of financial advisors had helped Eleanor construct over the past several months. The floor was clean packed earth again, the stone slab replaced but no longer necessary, the shelves cleared of the canvas bags and oilcloth bundles that had lined them for 100 years. The room was empty, just stone and wood and cold air and the particular silence of a space that has held something important and released it. Eleanor sat on the floor of the empty chamber with her back against the wall and let the silence be what it was. She thought about her great-grandfather, who had crossed an ocean with his wealth in a form that banks could not touch and buried it in the dark ground of a country he was learning to claim as his. She thought about the generations who had come after him, who had understood what he had built and added to it quietly, without drawing attention, the way you do when you have learned that attention is a form of danger. She thought about her father, who had understood all of it and had chosen her to receive it, not because she was the most convenient choice or the easiest one, but because he had seen her clearly enough to know she was the right one. She thought about Garland, about the conversation she had not yet had with him, that she was going to have, at some point, in some form, because they were family and she was not a person who believed that families should stay broken when they could be partially mended. Not wholly mended, she was not naive about what the last 11 years had been and what the last year on top of that had added to it, but partially, imperfectly, in the way that things are mended when the people involved are real and the damage has been real and there is no version of moving forward that requires pretending otherwise. She was not ready for that conversation yet, but she was getting closer. What she knew, sitting in the empty chamber, was this. She had paid $4,212 to keep this building. She had paid it when it was almost everything she had, because something in her had understood, without being able to say it clearly, that letting it go would be a kind of self-betrayal she could not afford. She had not known what was under the floor, but she had known the building was hers, and that it had been given to her by a man who loved her in the way quiet people love through the things they protect and the things they choose not to explain and the care they take, in the limited time they have, to make certain the right person receives what is meant for them. She had been her father's daughter all along. She just hadn't had the proof until now. She sat in the old smokehouse and let that be true. Let it settle into her the way gold settles in the earth, patient, permanent, belonging exactly where it is. Outside, the October light moved through the box elders. The field stretched out flat and dark toward the county road. Somewhere across that field, in the farmhouse that had been her childhood home, her brother was living the life their father had given him, with the land and the equipment and the grain bins and the pond, with the 112 acres of some of the best bottomland in Indiana, and whatever understanding he had come to about what he had and what he did not have and why. Eleanor did not know what that understanding looked like for him. She supposed she would find out, eventually. For now, she sat in the quiet of the old stone room and felt the particular, uncomplicated satisfaction of a woman who had held on to something everyone else had written off and had been proven, in the most consequential way possible, to have been right. She was going to do something with this. Something that mattered. Something that stretched beyond her own life into the lives of other people who needed what she had once needed, not money, not exactly, though money was part of it, but the stubborn insistence of someone who believed they deserved to hold on, and held on anyway, past the point where holding on made any visible sense. She did not know yet exactly what form that would take. She was still figuring it out, the way she had always figured out the hardest problems, by starting with what she knew and following the columns until the answer appeared. She would get there. She always got there in the end. The house Eleanor bought in November was not what anyone who knew her would have predicted, which was part of why she chose it. People who knew her, people who had known her when she was the bookkeeper with the cracked radiator and the thin margins, expected her to be sensible about it. Expected her to find something modest and efficient and appropriate to a person who had spent most of her adult life calibrating her needs to what she could afford. They expected her to stay in Indianapolis, where she had her clients and her community and her life, and to make small improvements to the circumstances of that life rather than large ones. She did stay in Indianapolis, but the house was a Victorian on a tree-lined street that she had walked past twice in earlier years, both times allowing herself a moment of uncomplicated wanting before reminding herself that wanting houses you cannot afford is a form of sentimentality you cannot carry for long without it becoming heavy. The house had a wraparound porch. It had high ceilings and plaster walls and a kitchen that had been renovated at some point in the 1990s and never updated again, which was not a problem because Eleanor had always found outdated kitchens more comfortable than modern ones. It had a garden in the back that had been neglected for at least 3 years, and the previous owner had left behind. In the garage, an assortment of gardening tools that suggested someone had once intended to do something significant with the soil and then moved on before doing it. Eleanor bought the tools along with the house. She did not know how to garden, but she was willing to learn things she did not know how to do. That had always been her approach. You looked at the problem. You found someone who understood it better than you did. You listened carefully, and you paid attention, and eventually you could do it yourself, or at least well enough that you were not dependent on someone else to do it for you. She was applying this approach to a great many things in the winter after the discovery. The philanthropy question was the largest of them. She had known, sitting on the floor of the smokehouse on the night Martin Bryce gave her the final number, that she was going to do something with the portion of this that exceeded her own reasonable needs. This was not altruism in the pure sense. It was partly that, but it was also something more practical, more grounded in who she was. She was a person who noticed when columns didn't balance. $322 million coming into a single person's life was a column that didn't balance, and the way to balance it was to move some of it outward, into places where it could do work that one person's life was too small to contain. She began meeting with people, foundation directors, nonprofit leaders, researchers, educators. She sat across from them in offices and conference rooms and coffee shops and asked them to tell her what they needed. Not what they thought she wanted to hear, what they actually needed. She had a bookkeeper's instinct for when numbers were being softened for her benefit, and she used it. And people who tried to impress her with polished presentations found that she was more interested in the messy truth beneath the presentation than in the presentation itself. She found, in the course of these meetings, that she had a particular interest in a certain kind of problem. Not the largest problems. She was not naive enough to believe that her portion of $322 million was going to solve hunger or climate change or the other immensities that required resources beyond what any individual held. But the specific, targeted, addressable problems. The ones where the gap between what existed and what was needed was a gap that money could actually close. The first initiative she funded, in February, was a legal aid organization in Indianapolis that represented people in property disputes who could not afford attorneys. She had chosen this without quite intending to, had learned about it in a meeting that had been scheduled for a different purpose, and had veered off course in the way that useful conversations sometimes do. The director had described, with the calm precision of someone who had been doing this work for 20 years, the cases that kept her up at night. People who had inherited property, small parcels, family land, the kind of assets that existed just above the threshold of poverty and just below the threshold of professional advice, and who lost those assets not because they had no right to them, but because they had no one to help them assert that right. Eleanor had written the check at the table before the meeting ended. The director had looked at the amount and said, carefully, "This is very generous." Eleanor said, "I know what it costs to almost lose something you're owed." If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She met with Garland in March. Not because she was ready, exactly, but because she had realized, during a conversation with Patricia in February, that waiting until she was fully ready was a way of never having the conversation at all. She was never going to be entirely ready to sit across a table from her brother and have an honest accounting of the last 11 years. That was not a conversation you prepared for so much as one you simply made yourself have. She drove out to the county on a Saturday morning. The same drive she had made in November, but in different weather. The first real thaw of the year, mud and meltwater in the fields, the sky a washed-out blue that promised nothing specific. She did not park at the smokehouse. She drove up the main lane to the farmhouse and knocked on the door. Garland answered. He was wearing work clothes, the kind you wear when you are doing things in a barn in early spring. And he looked at Eleanor with an expression she could not immediately read, not quite surprise, because he had known this was coming eventually, but something adjacent to it. A man who has been expecting a conversation and is startled to find it standing on his doorstep. He let her in. He made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table in the farmhouse where they had grown up, in a kitchen that Garland's wife had remodeled before she died 8 years ago, and that looked nothing like it had when their mother was alive, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. Then Garland said, "I didn't know there was gold down there." Eleanor looked at him. "I want you to know that," he said. "I had an idea that the building might be worth more than it appeared." Dad made certain comments over the years. Nothing specific. He was never specific about anything he wanted kept private. But there was the way he talked about it. The way he checked the lock every time he passed it. I thought maybe there was cash, or documents, or something. I didn't know what. "But you knew it was more than a stone outbuilding," Eleanor said. He met her eyes. "Yes. And you offered to buy it from me for less than the land was worth." His jaw tightened. "Yes, I did." She let that sit. He said, "I told myself it was fair. I told myself the offer was reasonable given what I could observe, which was a deteriorating structure on a landlocked parcel. I told myself you would be better off with cash than with a building you couldn't use." He paused. "I was rationalizing." "Yes," Eleanor said. "You were." He was quiet for a moment. The coffee maker on the counter gurgled and settled. Outside, something moved in the barn, the sound of a horse shifting in its stall. "I'm not going to apologize for the appeal," he said. "That was my legal right, and I believed I had a case." "Your attorneys believed you had a case," Eleanor said. "I think you had a rationalization that you paid attorneys to construct into a case." He looked at her with an expression she recognized from decades back, the expression of a man who is considering being angry and deciding not to be. That was Garland's face when he thought you had made a point he could not refute. She had seen it at the dinner table when they were children, when their father had said something that ended an argument by being simply and undeniably correct. Their father had made that face too. After a while, Garland said, "What do you want from me?" Eleanor thought about what she wanted. It was not, she had discovered, the obvious thing. It was not revenge or restitution or a formal acknowledgement of wrong. It was not even an apology, though an apology might come in time, and she would accept it if it did. What she wanted was simpler and harder than any of those things. "I want to be your sister again," she said. "Not the way we were before, because before wasn't working for either of us. Something different. Honest. Without the assumption that the way things have been distributed determines who matters." Garland looked at the table for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, "I always thought Dad loved you best." Eleanor stared at him. He said, "You were the one he talked about. When things happened in your life, your marriage, your divorce, your business, any of it, he always knew. He always kept track. He didn't talk about you to me, but I could tell he was paying attention in a way he didn't pay attention to Franklin and me the same way. I used to think it was unfair. I used to think he saved something for you that he didn't give us." Eleanor's throat felt tight. "He kept track by reading my letters," she said. "I sent him a letter every few months. He never wrote back, but he read them. He kept every one of them," Garland said. "They were in his desk drawer when he died." She looked at her hands on the table. She had not known that. They sat in the kitchen for 2 more hours. The coffee got cold. Garland's dog came in from outside and settled under the table and went to sleep. They talked about things they had not talked about in 11 years, and some things they had never talked about at all, and by the end of it they had not fixed anything, because some things cannot be fixed, but they had established, tentatively, the possibility of something they had not had before. A beginning. Outside, walking back to her car, Eleanor stopped and turned to look at the smokehouse through the box elders. In the pale March light, with the new mortar in the joints and the roof patched and the box elders trimmed back from the north wall, it looked like what it was, an old stone building on a cold piece of ground, well made and well kept, built to last. She had been her father's daughter all along. She just hadn't had the proof until now. Spring came to Indiana the way it always does in that part of the country, not gradually, not with the slow warming that other latitudes enjoy, but in lurches, as if the season were being hauled forward by something impatient. A warm week in March, then a freeze that killed everything the warmth had encouraged, then another warm week, and then one morning you woke up and the trees had decided without consulting anyone that it was time, and within 48 hours the world had gone from gray to green in a transformation so abrupt it felt almost aggressive. Eleanor noticed it from the porch of the Victorian house on the tree-lined street. She had made a habit of sitting there in the mornings with her first coffee, before anything else began, before the emails and the meetings and the careful, incremental work of turning $322 million into something that meant more than the number itself. She sat and watched the street wake up, the dog walkers and the early commuters, and the family 2 houses down, whose children left for school at exactly 7:52 every morning with the punctuality of people who had built a life around specific times. She had been watching them for 4 months. She did not know their names. She thought, occasionally, that she ought to introduce herself. She was, after all, a neighbor now, not a temporary resident, but an actual neighbor with a deed and a property tax bill, and a cat named Horace who sat in the front window and observed the street with the proprietary air of an animal who had decided that everything he could see belonged to him by right of observation. She had not introduced herself yet. She was still learning how to live in a house she owned outright, which was a different thing from living in a house you were renting, or a house you were paying off slowly, or a house that existed at the edge of what you could afford. Owning something completely, without debt or uncertainty, changed the quality of your relationship to it in ways she had not anticipated. The house felt more hers, and also more serious. More like a commitment. More like the beginning of something rather than the continuation of something else. She was still getting used to that. The investigator's report arrived in April. She had hired the investigator in February, a woman named Rosa Chun who specialized in genealogical research and historical asset tracing, the kind of work that required equal parts archival patience and detective instinct. Eleanor had retained her for a specific purpose, to understand, as completely as possible, the history of what had been found under the smokehouse floor. The gold's physical history, its weight, its purity, its approximate dating had been established by the appraisers. But Eleanor wanted the human history. She wanted to know the story. Rosa Chin's report was 43 pages long, with appendices. Eleanor read it on a Saturday morning on the porch, with her second coffee, working through it slowly the way she worked through complex financial documents, not looking for a summary, but letting the full picture assemble itself page by page. The man who had broken the ground had been named Wilhelm Voss. He had been born in 1831 in the Kingdom of Bavaria, in a town that no longer existed by that name, in a region that had been reorganized and renamed so many times in the subsequent century and a half that tracing it required the kind of archival tenacity that Rosa Chun had clearly applied without complaint. He had been the third son of a merchant family, a family that had been, by the standards of their time and place, prosperous. Not wealthy in the way that meant land and titles, but wealthy in the way that meant a business with regular customers and a house with more than one room and children who were educated rather than simply employed. In 1847, when Wilhelm Voss was 16 years old, the family bank collapsed. Rosa Chun had found the records. The bank had been overextended into railway speculation at exactly the wrong moment, when the first great railway bubble of the German states was deflating and taking with it the savings of everyone who had believed in the permanence of paper promises. The Voss family had lost almost everything. Wilhelm's father, a man who had spent 30 years building a business and a reputation, died within 18 months of the collapse, of what the records called a wasting illness, and what Rosa Chin's note in the margin suggested was probably a broken heart expressed through the body. Wilhelm was 17 when his father died. He was the third son, which meant he inherited nothing, the estate passing to the eldest brother according to the custom of the time. He was educated, which meant he had skills but not capital. He was angry, which the records could not document directly, but which Rosa Chun had inferred from his subsequent actions, with the kind of careful inference that distinguished her work from speculation. He left Bavaria in 1852. He was 21 years old. He carried with him, according to the ship manifest Rosa Chun had found in the Hamburg emigration records, personal effects and a wooden trunk listed as containing tools and books. The trunk was not inspected. Trunks belonging to emigrating young men in 1852 were rarely inspected. The officials at the Hamburg docks had more significant concerns than the precise contents of a 21-year-old Bavarian's luggage. What Wilhelm Voss carried in that trunk, Rosa Chun wrote in the measured language of a professional who was presenting conclusions carefully, was almost certainly the physical remains of whatever liquid wealth his family had managed to convert to. Hard assets before the bank failure stripped them of everything else. Gold coin, primarily the currencies of the German states, the Austrian Empire, the trade coins that circulated through the mercantile networks his father had moved in for 30 years. Some of it the family savings. Some of it, Rosa Chin's research suggested, the deliberate conversion of whatever paper assets remained into metal that could be carried without a bank's permission and spent without a bank's intermediary. Wilhelm Voss had learned, at 17, that paper wealth was a promise someone else could break. He had spent the next 4 years, before he left, converting every promise he could reach into something that could not be broken. He arrived in Indiana in 1853, after a period in New York that Rosachon could document only partially, and that appeared to involve labor, frugality, and the steady accumulation of passage money for the journey west. He purchased land in the southwestern corner of the county in 1854, 120 acres of bottomland that had been cleared once and allowed to revert. Cheap, because it needed work and nobody else wanted to do the work it needed. He was 23 years old, and he paid for the land in cash that he carried in a leather bag and counted out on a surveyor's table in the county seat, in coins that the clerk recorded, with some puzzlement, as being mostly foreign. He built the farmhouse in 1855. He built the smokehouse in 1857, with stone he quarried from a creek bed 5 miles to the north, hauling it himself because he could not afford help and did not want to owe anyone the kind of debt that required ongoing payment. He built the walls 18 inches thick and fitted the floor with a flat stone slab over a small cellar he had dug by hand before the walls went up, because he had learned, at 17, that the place you kept your most valuable things was the place nobody expected and nobody could access without your permission. He put the trunk in the cellar. He sealed the slab. He built a smokehouse over it. He married in 1860 a woman named Helena Braun, whose family had emigrated from the Rhine Valley and who understood, without needing it explained, why a man might want his most important things kept in a stone room under a stone floor with an iron lock on the door above. Her family had their own history with banks and paper promises, and the morning you woke up to find that everything careful people had built could be taken in an afternoon by forces they did not control and could not stop. They had 4 children. The eldest was Eleanor's great-grandfather, who had inherited the farm and the smokehouse and the knowledge that went with both of them, who had added to the cellar what he saved and what he converted and what his father's trunk had not held, because the trunk was full, but time was generous, and the habit of accumulation, once established in a family, tends to persist across generations the way any habit persists through repetition and example and the deep bodily memory of what it felt like to lose everything and what it cost to build it back. Eleanor set the report down on the porch railing and looked at the street. 140 years. For generations. A trunk on a Hamburg dock in 1852 and a stone slab under an Indiana smokehouse in 2024, and everything in between was the story of people who had decided, at great cost and with great conviction, that they were never going to be caught without recourse again. She thought about Wilhelm Voss at 17, watching his father's business dissolve. She thought about the anger Rosachon had inferred from his subsequent actions, the particular cold fury of a young man who has understood that the systems other people trust can fail without warning and without mercy. She thought about what it meant to carry that understanding across an ocean and into a new country and embed it, literally, in the ground. She thought about her own father, Raymond Voss, who had kept the lock checked and the door padlocked and the knowledge held close, and who had revised his will 14 months before he died to make certain that what Wilhelm had begun in 1857 passed to the child who would understand it. He had been right about her. She picked up the report and went inside to call Rosachon, to ask the questions the report had raised but not answered about Helena Braun's family, about what the second generation had added and why, about whether there were other records that might shed light on the specific decisions that had brought the collection from a trunk on a Hamburg dock to a sealed chamber in an Indiana smokehouse over the course of a century and a half. Rosachon answered on the second ring and said she had been expecting the call. They talked for 2 hours. The story that emerged from those 2 hours, and from the additional research Rosachon conducted over the following month, was not a simple story of hoarding or eccentricity or the stubborn refusal of immigrant families to integrate into the financial systems of their adopted country. It was more complicated and more human than that. The story of people who had real and specific reasons for the choices they made, reasons that made complete sense given what they had experienced and what they feared. Wilhelm Voss had not simply distrusted banks in the abstract. He had watched a bank failure destroy his family. He had converted his resources accordingly and taught his children to do the same. His son, Eleanor's great-grandfather, had been born in 1865, 12 years after Wilhelm arrived in Indiana, and had grown up in a household where the lesson of 1847 was not ancient history, but living context, the story that explained why your father checked the lock every time he passed. The smokehouse, why there were conversations that happened inside the house and not outside it. Why some things were understood without being said. He had been a farmer, like his father. He had been careful, like his father. He had added to the collection what he could not dramatically, not in large single acquisitions, but steadily, the way a person saves when saving is a practice rather than a goal. Every good year, a portion of what the farm produced went to gold. Every time the papers reported on a banking crisis in some other part of the country, and the late 19th century was full of banking crises. The panics of 1873 and 1893 and 1907, each producing their own wave of ruined families and broken savings, he had added to the store rather than let the anxiety pass without action. By the time Eleanor's grandfather inherited the farm in the 1920s, the collection had grown substantially. And then came 1929. Rosa Chun had found letters. Not many. The Voss family was not a family of prolific correspondence, but enough. Letters between Eleanor's grandfather and his brother, who had moved to Chicago and kept his savings in a bank and lost everything in the collapse of 1931. The letters documented something Rosa Chun described, in a brief editorial aside that was the most direct expression of feeling in her otherwise scrupulously neutral report, as heartbreaking. A man watching his brother lose everything his family had worked for, powerless to help in ways that could be documented, able to offer only the knowledge that the farm was solid and the land was good and there was room, if it came to that, for people who needed to come home. The brother had not come home. He had stayed in Chicago and rebuilt, slowly, the way people did. But Eleanor's grandfather had spent the 1930s adding to the collection with a focus and consistency that suggested he understood, perhaps more clearly than any previous generation, that what Wilhelm had begun in the smokehouse cellar was not a personal quirk, but a family survival system, a hedge against the catastrophes that history kept delivering to people who had trusted the wrong structures. By 1941, when Eleanor's grandfather revised his own will for the first time, the collection was worth, in that era's terms, a significant fraction of what it would eventually become. He wrote in the margin of the will, in pencil, that Rosa Chun had photographed in the county probate records. The smokehouse stays in the family. The next generation will know what to do with it. Eleanor's father had known. He had grown up knowing. He had been told at some age that Rosa Chun estimated, from the available evidence, as probably around 12 or 13, old enough to understand, young enough to hold the secret, as simply part of who the family was. He had checked the lock every time he passed it because his father had checked it every time he passed it, because his father before that had checked it every time he passed it, because Wilhelm Voss had built a habit into the family's relationship to that building that had outlasted everyone who started it. He had added to the collection. Rosa Chun found evidence of this in Raymond Voss's financial records, available in the estate documents, regular withdrawals of cash, unremarkable in size individually, unremarkable in pattern to anyone who was not looking for them. Over 40 years of farming, Raymond Voss had converted a quiet, steady portion of his income to gold and added it to what his father had left him. He had never told his sons. Eleanor sat with that knowledge for a long time. He had never told his sons, whether because he did not trust them with it, or because he believed they were too much like the men who had sold the land rather than the men who had built it, or because he had understood, in the quiet way he understood most things, that Garland and Franklin would see the collection as capital to be deployed rather than as legacy to be honored. She could not know. She would never know. Raymond Voss was not here to explain himself, but he had told her, not in words, not directly, but he had separated the parcel. He had left her the building. He had kept every letter she sent him in the drawer of his desk, and he had known, when he revised that will 14 months before he died, exactly who Eleanor was and exactly what she would do. He had trusted her with it. She thought about that on the porch in the spring mornings, with the coffee and the dog walkers and the children who left for school at exactly 7:52. She thought about what it meant to be trusted with something you didn't know you were carrying. The public story had taken on a life she had not fully anticipated. The news coverage had been significant from the beginning. $322 million discovered under a rural smokehouse was not the kind of story that stayed local, but it had settled, after the first few weeks, into a kind of background hum rather than the acute noise of a breaking story. Reporters moved on to other things. The legal proceedings were not dramatic enough to sustain ongoing coverage. Eleanor was not a person who sought cameras, and the absence of a willing subject made the story harder to keep alive. What she had not expected was the letters. They began arriving in February, forwarded through Diane's office, because Diane had quietly established herself as the first filter between Eleanor and the world. Hundreds of them, eventually thousands, from people all over the country. Some of them were from people who had inherited property they didn't understand and wanted advice. Some were from people who had been treated the way Eleanor had been treated, the sibling who got less, the child the family had underestimated, the person who had held on to something everyone else said was worthless and had been proven quietly right. Some were from people who simply needed to tell someone that they recognized what had happened to her, that they understood it from the inside, that her story was in some way their story told differently. She read every one of them. She did not respond to all of them, there were too many, and her time was already stretched in directions she was still learning to manage, but she read every one. And in March, when she sat down with her assistant Kezia and the foundation attorney she had retained in January, and the young program director she had hired in February, and they talked about what the foundation was going to do and how it was going to do it, and what kind of people it was going to serve, the letters were part of that conversation. The foundation was called, simply, the Voss Foundation. Eleanor had considered other names, more descriptive names, names that communicated the specific mission more efficiently. But in the end she had come back to Voss, because it was her name and her family's name and the name on a ship manifest in Hamburg in 1852, and because the foundation was, in a way that she did not feel the need to explain to anyone, but that was clear to her, continuous with Wilhelm Voss's decision to carry what he had across an ocean and plant it in the ground of a country he intended to stay in. The mission was threefold. The first element was the legal aid initiative she had already started funding for organizations that represented people in property and estate disputes who could not afford representation. She had expanded this from the original Indianapolis organization to 7 states by spring, with a plan to reach 20 by the end of the year. The demand was larger than she had expected, and the supply of adequate legal help smaller, which was a gap she intended to address as directly as she could manage. The second element was something she had come to through the letters. A substantial number of the people who wrote to her were dealing with what she began to call, in her conversations with the program director, the problem of invisible assets. Property or goods or family resources that existed but were not recognized, documented, or accessible because the people who held them did not have the professional support to understand what they had or how to protect it. This was, she recognized, a version of her own situation. Before November. She had known she owned the smokehouse, but she had not known what it held or how to claim it, and without the metal detector and the bolt cutters and the willingness to dig in cold earth, she might never have found out. The foundation's second element funded asset assessment services for families with complex or undocumented holdings, the kind of professional help that wealthy families retained automatically and everyone else accessed rarely or not at all. The third element was the most personal and the hardest to talk about in foundation language, which tended toward precision and measurability and outcomes that could be reported in annual reviews. It was a fund for what Eleanor, when pressed by the program director to define it, called the cost of not selling. She explained it this way: when you hold on to something other people tell you to let go of, there are costs. Real material costs. You pay taxes on property you cannot use. You maintain insurance on assets you cannot liquidate. You absorb the carrying costs of things that have not yet revealed their value. These costs are manageable when you have resources and untenable when you do not, which means that people with the least are the most likely to be forced to sell what they should keep. The fund would help cover those carrying costs for people in documented need, not indefinitely, not unconditionally, but as a bridge between the moment of inheritance or acquisition and the moment of understanding, which could take time that not everyone could afford. She had named it the Bridge Fund. Kezia had printed the name on the first board meeting agenda, and Eleanor had looked at it on the paper and felt, for a moment, The same alignment she had felt sitting on the floor of the empty smokehouse in October, the feeling of something being exactly right. The board of the Voss Foundation held its first formal meeting in May, in a conference room in the Victorian house on the tree-lined street. Because Eleanor did not yet have an office, and the house was large enough, and she saw no reason to pay for a conference room when she had a dining room table that seated 8. The board was small, 5 people, including Eleanor, and had been selected with the same methodical care she applied to everything. The other 4 were people she had met in the months since November, people whose judgment she had tested in conversation and found sound, people who understood the specific territory the foundation was working in and had no interest in the kind of governance that prioritizes the appearance of competence over its reality. The meeting lasted 3 hours and covered more ground than Eleanor had expected. By the end of it, the foundation had approved its first full year of grants, established its operating principles, and scheduled a public announcement for June, the first time Eleanor intended to speak publicly and at length about what had happened and what she intended to do about it. She had been dreading the announcement. She was not, by nature or by preference, a person who spoke publicly. She had spent 20 years in work that required precision and discretion and the particular kind of intelligence that functions best in the background, noticing things without announcing them, standing in front of a room full of people and saying, "Here is what happened to me. Here is what I am doing about it." That was not a mode she had practiced. But she understood why it was necessary. The letters had made her understand. There were too many people who recognized themselves in her story and who needed to see what it looked like when the story continued past the discovery, past the legal battles, past the initial shock of the number. They needed to see the afterward. Not the triumphant afterward of certainty and ease, but the real one, the one where you were still learning, still uncertain about a great many things, still sometimes sitting on your porch in the morning wondering whether you were doing it right. She prepared for the announcement by writing it out longhand, the way she had learned to think through difficult accounting problems, not typing, not dictating, but writing in her own hand, which made the words slower and more deliberate and more honestly hers. She wrote, "I am not going to tell you that I always knew. I didn't. I held on to a stone building in a county I no longer lived in because I was stubborn and because it was mine, and those are not the same as wisdom, though sometimes they produce similar results. I held on because letting go felt like agreeing with the story someone else was telling about who I was and what I deserved, and I was not willing to agree with that story even when I couldn't articulate a better one." She wrote, "My father knew what was in that building. He knew for his entire adult life. He built his farm and raised his children and went to sleep every night with the knowledge that there was something under the smokehouse floor that would outlast all of it, that would be there when the time came for it to be there. He chose, with care and with documentation and with the irreversible formality of a legal instrument, who that time would come to. He chose me. I don't know all his reasons. I know some of them. I know that he kept every letter I sent him in the drawer of his desk, and I know that he never wrote back. And I know that the two of those facts together say something about him that I am still learning how to hold." She wrote, "What I want to tell you is this. The thing you are holding on to, the thing that everyone tells you is not worth the cost of keeping, the thing that requires more from you than you can sometimes afford, it may not have $300 million under it. Probably it doesn't. But that is not the only measure of what something is worth. The measure is whether it belongs to you, whether you earned the right to it through patience or love or stubbornness, or the simple refusal to let go of your own story. If it does, hold on." She had not intended to say that last part. She had written it without planning it and then read it back and left it in, because it was the truest thing in the document, and she had decided, in the months since November, that she was going to prioritize truth over comfort in the situations where the two diverged. The announcement was held on a Tuesday in June in a community room at the Indianapolis Public Library. There were perhaps 200 people in the room: journalists, foundation representatives, people from the legal aid organizations she had funded, people who had simply read about her and come, for reasons she did not know and did not ask about. Kezia sat in the front row. Patricia sat beside Kezia. Diane sat in the second row with the expression of an attorney observing her client's public debut with professional attention. In the third row, in a seat he had not told her he would be occupying, sat Wilhelm Voss. Eleanor saw him when she walked to the front of the room. He was in a jacket and tie, which she had not seen him wear in years, and he was sitting very still with his hands in his lap, and his expression arranged into something she could not immediately read, not the patience she was used to from him, not the calculation, but something more unguarded. Something that looked, from across the room, like a man who had driven 2 hours to sit in a library in Indianapolis because he needed to hear what his sister was going to say. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. She went to the front of the room and said what she had written, mostly in the words she had written, with the additions and subtractions that happen when you speak something you have only written when the room becomes real and the faces become real, and the words have to survive contact with all of that without losing their truth. She talked about Wilhelm Voss in Bavaria in 1847, about the trunk on the Hamburg dock, about 140 years of cold Indiana earth holding what one family had decided was worth protecting. She talked about the letter from the attorney and the back taxes and the bolt cutters and the metal detector screaming in the corner of the smokehouse. She talked about what it cost to hold on and what it meant that she had been able to, and what she intended to do about the fact that most people could not afford to hold on the way she had. She talked for 35 minutes. The room was very quiet. When she finished, there was a pause that lasted perhaps 5 seconds, and then the room began to applaud, and she stood at the front of it and felt, for the first time since November without any reservation or qualification, genuinely and completely glad that she had come. Afterward, in the lobby, Garland found her. He looked like a man who had prepared something to say and then decided, at the last moment, not to say it, which was, she supposed, progress of a kind. Instead, he said, simply, "That was well done." She said, "You didn't have to come." He said, "I know." They stood in the library lobby with people moving around them, and the noise of the room behind them, and the particular quality of a silence between two people who have said difficult things to each other and have more to say and are taking their time about it. He said, "Rosa Chen's report. The one about Wilhelm. Did you know she sent me a copy?" Eleanor had not known that. Rosa had not mentioned it. She said, "No, I didn't ask her to." Garland nodded. "She sent it on her own initiative. She said she thought it was the kind of history that belonged to the whole family, not only to the person who commissioned the research." He paused. She was right. Eleanor looked at her brother. He said, "I didn't know about him. About Wilhelm. I knew the farm had been in the family a long time, but I didn't know the story. Dad never talked about it." He said it slowly, as if he were still deciding whether to say it, as if the words required more from him than ordinary words did. "I've been thinking about it since the report came. About a man who watched everything fall apart and decided to carry what he had, literally, in a trunk, and plant it somewhere he intended to stay." He looked at Eleanor. "We came from that. Both of us." "Yes," she said. "We did." He said, "I behaved badly. After Dad died, and in the years since. The offers I made, and the appeal, and the all of it. I behaved badly, and I knew it while I was doing it, and I told myself stories about fairness and reasonable market value, and what Dad probably intended, and the stories were comfortable, but they weren't honest." Eleanor held this. The apology she had not expected, arriving in the form of a man who was not naturally given to apology, and was making one anyway, because he had decided that the discomfort of it was less than the discomfort of not having made it. She said, "I know." He said, "I'd like to be better at this. At being your brother. If that's still possible." She thought about the kitchen in March, the cold coffee and the dog under the table, and the letters her father had kept in the desk drawer. She thought about what it meant that he had come today, that he had put on a jacket and tie and driven 2 hours and sat in a library and listened to his sister say the things that needed to be said. She said, "It's still possible. I think it's going to take a while." He said, "I've got time." She almost smiled. That was something their father would have said. Not exactly the words, but the rhythm of them, the plain acknowledgement that time was the resource required and he was willing to give it. She recognized it in her brother's voice and felt, in that recognition, the strange and complicated comfort of shared origin, the reminder that even the people who hurt you carry parts of the people you love, and that is not a reason to forgive everything, but it is a reason to remain in conversation. She said, "So have I." The summer moved through its ordinary business. Eleanor planted the garden behind the Victorian house, badly at first, and then less badly as the season progressed, and she learned, through error and observation, what she was doing. She grew tomatoes and herbs and a row of zinnias along the south fence that her mother would have liked. She started, in July, a habit of walking in the mornings, not for exercise, exactly, but for the specific pleasure of moving through a world she was allowed to move through freely, at her own pace, in the direction she chose. She met the family 2 houses down in August, when their youngest child's ball rolled into her garden, and she carried it back to the fence and handed it over to the mother, who was named Claudette, and who had the kind of warm, practical directness that Eleanor found immediately comfortable. They talked over the fence for 20 minutes about gardens and the neighborhood and the bakery that had opened on the corner and was producing croissants that Claudette described, with the conviction of someone who had done comparative research, as objectively the best in the city. Eleanor went to the bakery the next morning. The croissants were, in fact, objectively the best she had had in years. She went back the following morning, and the one after that, and within 2 weeks she had become the kind of regular customer whose order the person behind the counter began preparing when she walked through the door, which was a small thing and also, in the arithmetic of a life being rebuilt from the beginning, not small at all. In September, she went back to the Smokehouse. She went alone, on a Saturday morning, in the early fall light that turned the box elders gold and made the old stone walls look warmer than they were. She parked at the edge of the property, the way she always did, and walked through the trees to the building that had, 14 months ago, been the thing nobody wanted. The door opened easily. The interior was clean and cool and smelled of stone, the way it always had. The metallic mineral smell that she now understood was the smell of the earth that had held what it held for 140 years. The floor was smooth, the slab replaced, and the surface swept, the shelves empty and the hooks hanging clean against the walls. She stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, the way she had on the day she first came here, with the bolt cutters and the shovel and the metal detector that had screamed in the corner. The room was the same. Everything else was different. She thought about what to do with the building. This was a question she had been turning over for months, in the margins of everything else. The smokehouse had been restored. It was hers. It was, by virtue of what had been found beneath it, a significant place, not famous, exactly, not historical in the registered sense, but significant in the way that places are significant when they hold a long story in their walls. She could use it for storage, which was its original purpose. She could let it stand empty, which required maintenance but imposed no obligations. She could donate it to a historical society, which she had been approached about twice and had deflected twice because the conversations had moved too quickly to conclusions she had not reached yet. She had decided, sitting in the Victorian house one evening in August with Rosa Chin's 43-page report on the table beside her, that she knew what it should be. It should be a record, not a museum exactly, not open to the public in the formal sense, but a place where the story was held, where Wilhelm's trunk was documented, where the family history was archived, where the people who came after Eleanor, whoever they turned out to be, could come and understand what 4 generations of Voss men and women had carried and why, and what it cost them and what it meant. She wanted the story preserved. She had contacted an archivist in Indianapolis in September to begin discussing what this might look like in practice. They had met twice, and the archivist, a woman named Dr. Femi Adeyemi, who specialized in family and community archives, and who had listened to Eleanor's account of the smokehouse with an expression of profound professional interest, had proposed something that Eleanor had not considered but immediately recognized as right. Not just a family archive, a community one. The county, Dr. Adeyemi pointed out, had a great many families like the Voss family. Immigrant families who had carried things across oceans or across state lines and planted them in the ground of this flat Indiana county and built lives over them. Families whose histories existed in attics and barns and cellar floors and old trunks, and the memories of people who were getting old and had never found the right person to tell their stories to. An archive attached to the smokehouse, small, careful, community-built, could hold more than one family's story. Eleanor had said, yes, that's exactly what it should be. They had begun planning in October, 2 months after the conversation, a year after the bolt cutters and the cold earth and the metal detector that would not stop screaming. The archive would take years to build properly. That was all right. Eleanor was a person who understood that the things worth doing rarely resolved quickly, and she had developed, over the past year, an entirely different relationship to patience than the one she had carried through the decades before it. She stood in the smokehouse in the early fall light and looked at the room that Wilhelm Voss had built in 1857 over the cellar he had dug by hand. And she thought about all the people who had stood in this room and known what was below it and kept that knowledge as a form of love. She thought about Raymond Voss checking the lock every time he passed. She thought about the letters in the desk drawer. She thought about what it meant to be seen by someone who loved you enough to trust you with the most important thing they had, without explaining themselves, without asking for anything in return, only leaving you the key and trusting you to find the door. She had found it. She had found it because she was stubborn and because she was her father's daughter and because she had paid $4,212 when it was almost everything she had, and because some part of her had known, in the way that people know things they cannot yet say, that holding on was the right thing to do. The autumn light moved through the box elders. The stone walls held the quiet. Below the replaced slab, the earth was packed and dark, still carrying the shape of what had rested in it for so long. Eleanor Voss stood in the center of the old smokehouse and felt, for the second time in her life, like exactly who she was supposed to be. The first time had been the night of the discovery, sitting in the dark with the lantern and the cold air and the impossible number just beginning to become real. That had been the feeling of arriving somewhere she had been moving toward without knowing it. This was different. This was the feeling of having unpacked, of having set down what she was carrying and arranged it in the space available and looked at it in the light and understood that it fit, that she had enough room for all of it, the grief and the gratitude and the anger and the love and the work that was still ahead of her and the knowledge of who she came from and the knowledge of who she was. She was the woman who had not sold the smokehouse. She was the woman who had paid the taxes when it was almost everything she had. She was the woman her father had trusted with the most important thing he knew. She was Eleanor Voss, and she had more than enough. Outside, the October wind moved through the box elders, the same wind that had moved through them on the day she first came back, carrying the bolt cutters and the shovel and the stubborn, unnameable conviction that this building was hers and that what was hers was worth keeping. She locked the door behind her, walked back through the trees to the car, drove home. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. The winter that followed was the quietest she had known in years. Not quiet in the sense of empty. The foundation work was ongoing. The archive planning consumed whole days. The legal aid initiatives were expanding faster than she had initially projected, which was a good problem to have, and still a problem that required attention. Kezia was indispensable and occasionally overwhelming in her efficiency. Dr. Adeyemi sent detailed planning documents that required careful reading. The board met monthly, and monthly meetings with four intelligent people about things that mattered produced a specific kind of productive friction that was not restful, but quiet in the deeper sense. Quiet the way a room is quiet when the person in it has stopped waiting for something to go wrong. She had spent a long time, she understood now, waiting for things to go wrong. Not consciously, not with intention, but in the way that people carry the habits of lean years into better ones, the small economies of attention, the instinct to plan for shortage, the difficulty of accepting comfort as a permanent condition rather than a temporary one that would eventually correct itself. She had been waiting, for 11 years, and probably longer, for the other shoe to drop, for the situation to reveal its hidden costs, for the thing she was holding to be taken from her by forces she hadn't anticipated and couldn't control. The shoe had not dropped. What had happened instead was the opposite, not a taking but a giving, not a collapse but a revelation, not the exposure of the worst-case scenario she had been bracing for, but the arrival of something she had not known to brace for at all. She was still learning how to live in that. In November, on the one-year anniversary of the day she had driven out to the smokehouse in the borrowed truck, Eleanor did something she had not planned. She drove out to the county in the early morning, before anything else began, and parked at the edge of the lane and walked through the box elders to the building as the sun came up over the flat fields. She stood outside the smokehouse in the November light, the same pale pewter light as the year before, the same cold, the same particular quality of stillness that belongs to Indiana mornings in that season, and she stayed there for a long time. Not doing anything. Not thinking about foundation business or archive planning or the conversation she needed to have with the program director next week. Just standing there, in the place where everything had changed, letting the anniversary be what it was. She thought about the woman who had stood here a year ago with bolt cutters and a borrowed truck and $4,212 in her savings account. She thought about what that woman had known and what she hadn't known and what she had carried, without knowing she was carrying it, from a desk drawer in a farmhouse where a quiet man had kept every letter his daughter ever sent him. She thought, I wish I could tell you. She thought, I think you knew. She thought, I think that was the whole point. The light shifted. A car passed on the county road, far enough away to be only a sound. Somewhere in the fields to the north, a flock of geese was moving, the sound of them coming down through the cold air like a kind of punctuation. Eleanor stood in the November light outside the old smokehouse and felt, cleanly, and without complication, grateful. Not for the money. Or not only for the money was real and consequential, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, because pretending otherwise would have been dishonest, and dishonesty was a form of ingratitude she was not willing to perform. But grateful for the whole of it. For the letter from the attorney that had arrived when she was sitting at a kitchen table with a cold cup of tea, for the back taxes that had required almost everything she had, for the 11 years of distance that had been also 11 years of holding on, for the bolt cutters and the cold earth and the metal detector screaming in the corner, for Patricia arriving with her husband Thomas and a proper flashlight, for Diane Cho in a too-clean car on a November morning, for Martin Bryce's careful hands and precise language, for Rosa Chin's 43-page report and the image it contained of a 21-year-old man in a Hamburg port with a wooden trunk and a specific understanding of what paper promises were worth, for her father, who had checked the lock every time he passed, for his whole long quiet life, because he was a man who protected what he loved in the only language he fully trusted, which was the language of action and preparation and the irreversible legal document left in the hands of an attorney who would survive him, for the letters in the desk drawer, for being, all along, exactly the daughter he thought she was. The geese passed over, their sound diminishing northward, and Eleanor turned from the smokehouse and walked back through the box elders to her car. She had things to do. The foundation was not going to run itself, and the archive needed decisions made about its physical space, and Kezia had sent 3 emails since 6 that morning that she had not yet answered. She drove back toward Indianapolis through the flat country with the windows down a little, even in the cold, because she wanted to feel the air moving, the way you want to feel it when you have been inside something enclosed for a long time, and the outside is finally available, and you have finally, genuinely, stopped taking it for granted. The road ran straight and long through the fields, the same road she had driven a year ago in the borrowed truck with the heater that only worked on the passenger side. She drove it now in her own car, without hurry, in the direction she had chosen, toward a house she owned outright, and a life she was building from what she had been given and what she had refused to surrender and what she had found, at the end of a long patience, in the cold dark below the floor of an old stone building that nobody wanted. $322 million. For generations. 1 trunk on a Hamburg dock. 1 woman. Who did not sell. She drove home. The archive opened on the first Saturday of March, 2 years after Eleanor had first cut the padlock off the smokehouse door. It was not a grand opening. She had been offered grand openings. The local newspaper had proposed a ribbon cutting. Dr. Adeyemi's university colleagues had suggested a formal symposium. Someone from a documentary production company in Chicago had called twice about cameras. Eleanor had declined all of it. The archive was not a performance. It was a record, and records did not require ceremonies, only witnesses. There were 43 people in attendance. Eleanor knew most of them. The families who had contributed their own histories to the collection, 5 in total, all from the county, all with stories that intersected with the Voss land in ways that Rosa Chun had helped trace, and that had proven, once traced, to be more connected than anyone expected. The archivist, Dr. Adeyemi, who had driven out from Indianapolis with 2 of her graduate students and a careful, quiet enthusiasm that Eleanor had come to recognize as the emotion she expressed when something she believed in was becoming real. Diane, Patricia, Kezia, who had brought her mother, and Garland, who stood in the corner of the restored smokehouse with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the framed photographs on the walls. Wilhelm Voss's ship manifest from Hamburg, the first county land deed in Raymond Voss's handwriting, Rosa Chin's reconstruction of the family tree spread across 4 generations of Indiana winters with an expression Eleanor had not seen on his face before, something between recognition and loss. The look of a man encountering his own history for the first time and understanding, with that encounter, what it had cost him not to know it sooner. She stood beside him for a few minutes without speaking. They had gotten better at that over the past year. The comfortable silence of people who had said the hard things and were no longer required to fill every pause with reassurance. He said, eventually, pointing to a photograph of the farmhouse taken sometime in the 1920s, "I didn't know it looked like that then." She said, "Rosa found it in the County Historical Society's collection. Nobody knew it was there. He studied it." The farmhouse in the photograph was younger, the porch unwrapped, the oak tree in the front yard a sapling rather than the spreading landmark it had become. 2 figures stood on the front steps, too small and too distant for their faces to be legible, but present. There, occupying the frame of a photograph someone had thought worth taking. He said, "Do you know who they are?" She said, "Rosa thinks it's our grandfather and his brother. The one who moved to Chicago." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The one who lost everything in the bank collapse." "Yes." He looked at the photograph for another long moment. The brother who stayed and the brother who left, she thought, standing beside him. The brother who inherited the land and the knowledge and the lock he checked every time he passed it. And the brother who built something different in a different city and watched it dissolve in 1931 and came back to visit but did not come back to stay. Both of them real. Both of them gone. Both of them present in this room, in ways that had taken 100 years and a stone floor and $4,212 in back taxes to make visible. Garland said, without turning from the photograph, "Franklin called me last week. He wants to come see this." Eleanor considered that. Franklin, who held his share of the farm as an investment from Columbus and had sent 2 formal letters through attorneys in the past 2 years and had not otherwise been in contact, wanted to see the archive. She said, "He's welcome anytime." She meant it. Not warmly, not without reservation, but genuinely, in the way that things are genuine when they are chosen rather than felt. When you decide that a particular door should remain open even though opening it costs you something, because the cost of closing it is higher, and you have become, over the past 2 years, a person who calculates those costs honestly. The morning moved through its quiet business. People looked at the photographs and read the documents and asked Dr. Adeyemi questions she answered with the patient, specific generosity of someone who believed that this kind of knowledge was not a professional possession, but a shared one. The contributing families found their own names in the archive's collection and stood before them with the particular stillness of people encountering proof that they existed in time, that they were not only themselves, but the continuation of something longer. Eleanor stood in the center of the smokehouse and watched it all. The building was the same as it had always been, the 18-inch stone walls, the old wood frame, the floor smooth and solid over the sealed chamber below. But the room it held now was different from any room it had held before. Not a storage space, not a secret, not an insult or a booby prize or a landlocked liability on a quarter-acre nobody needed. A place where a family's story lived, where strangers' stories lived beside it, where the long, patient, underground work of people who had carried things across distances and buried them in new ground and trusted the next generation to understand what they had left, where all of that was finally visible, finally named, finally above ground and in the light. Eleanor Voss stood in the middle of it and felt, for the 3rd time in 2 years, exactly like who she was supposed to be. Outside, the March wind moved through the box elders. The fields were still winter gray, still waiting. But underneath them, as underneath everything in that part of the world, the ground was already changing, already becoming what the season required, already, in its patient, underground way, beginning again. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.